Hey guys, welcome everyone to Twilight. We hope you enjoy our videos. If there's anything in the video that you don't like or if you have any concerns, please let us know in the comment section. Let's keep the conversation going, but for now, let's head towards the video. What if Jamerica's arrival changed Edward and Bella's destiny? If yesterday's encounter with Edward hadn't been bizarre enough, when I began to wake up the next morning nothing seemed familiar. There was an unexplainable uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach that I could not name. It wasn't like the swarm of moths that had filled me while I had made a fool out of myself in biology attempting to hold a conversation with Edward. It also wasn't like the knot-clenching tension that had squeezed my insides from Edward's black eyes at our first encounter. Rather, the feeling, whatever it might be, warned me that I wasn't going to like the day. Since Edward was my primary stressor, my brain automatically reviewed our past interactions. We had correctly identified the slides and had a polite chat, even if it had been awkward and disjointed. Sure, I was concerned about my ability to keep my mouth shut around him, as his presence seemed to short-circuit my brain-to-mouth filter. Yet, as I evaluated myself further, it seemed like that concern also wasn't the feeling. Rather, it had a tone of foreboding, like the entire day was something to be apprehensive about, not just the dread of being with Edward in biology. Afraid of the feeling, because the unknown of what might be causing it, I kept my eyes shut tight, while my brain began to categorize the plethora of possibilities. Without intending to do so, my brain also started noting physical evidence. The first piece of data that shook me was the sheets that my fingertips were touching. The item itself was not worrisome, since I had just woken up in bed, after all. The concerning part was their texture. First, they were scratchier than they should have been. Not to say that Charlie's sheets were 8,000-count Egyptian cotton that cost more than my truck. Truthfully, they had probably been bought at one of the bigger stores in Port Angeles. They were simple basic sheets. Nevertheless, those sheets were soft in comparison to the part of the fabric under my hand. What my fingertips encountered was rough, like when you've washed them too much and they get little bits of fabric in a small ball. The information regarding the sheets was like fuel to my brain, causing it to want to solve the puzzle as quickly as possible. Rapidly, my brain began to register all the other parts of my body where there were sensations. For instance, the clothes I had on felt like sweats and a shirt, but not the same that I usually wore to bed. The bottoms felt like they belonged to a guy, and a large one at that. Added to this, the shirt was too tight, too small, like I had outgrown it, rather than being 2 sizes too big like I usually wore to bed. Then there was the awareness of having a bra on, which wasn't something I usually slept in, and underwear that was cut in all the wrong ways. Most startling was that there was fabric in places that cloth should never go. My best guess was that it was a thong. Something I had neither worn nor had any desire to do. Consequently, a headache was developing with the question of how I could even be wearing such an offending garment. That question led to many others. If it was possible to be wearing repulsive underwear, many things became unknown. My fears began to imagine time travel and all kinds of fictional options. Despite my growing apprehension, I was firmly aware of the fact that lying in bed with my eyes closed in confusion wouldn't solve a darn thing. If the years with my mother had taught me anything, it was that any situation was best handled by facing it and tackling it head on. Knowing that there was no more information to be gathered through touch, it was only logical to learn more through my other senses. Taking in a deep breath, my nose registered the smell of moisture that surrounded me, like the weather outside had come inside and settled into the walls and floors. It was a musty, damp green forestry smell. In an attempt to use that information to calm my feelings, my brain tried to compare it to see if there were any similarities to the smell of my room at Charlie's. Unfortunately, I could not recall the way that room smelled, as I had never paid close attention to it, only noting that it did not smell like Arizona. It did help a tiny bit to acknowledge that the smell ruled out being in Arizona and pretty much most areas of that region. Maybe by some luck I was still in Forks. Strangely, that small sliver of possible resemblance to a location calmed my racing heart some. True or not, there was comfort in the thought that if I was in Forks, then there were likely to be swans to seek help from. Thoughts of Charlie caused me to consider his life and non-factional options. Could I have fallen asleep at the Blacks or somewhere else like that? As my mind put all these pieces together, no answers appeared, especially as I couldn't conjure a memory of being on the reservation recently. For good measure, I tried to think of any reasonable explanation to be wearing strange clothes. I hadn't been drinking, as far as I could remember. Charlie hadn't taken me someplace in the middle of the night, as far as I knew. But what was clear to me was that no matter how impossible the situation seemed, there had to be a perfectly reasonable explanation. I just had to find it. Moving my brain out of fiction and horrible possibilities into some semblance of probability helped my nerves. Despite the comfort these possible explanations gave me, they for unexplainable reasons seemed more unlikely to me than the fictional options. Strangely, the possibility that I was in a future where my sheets were old and I had for bizarre reasons decided to wear a thong to bed was the least unsettling option. My imagination conjured images of living at Charlie's while attending college. Regardless of how I might wish for that option out of all the ones I had considered, it didn't quite fit, as something else was bothering me. However, I couldn't quite yet name it. What was clear nonetheless was that something that happened to me that couldn't be described by a simple explanation. Furthermore, the more that I thought, the more what was happening to me seemed impossible. A part of me was terrified, as not knowing what was happening and thus lacking a solution was abhorrent to me. Taking care of Rennie had taught me early on how expecting the bizarre was better and that lacking all the facts often made things worse. So many things could go wrong to the people I loved and thus were responsible for. Forcing my mind to be calm and my breathing to even out, I took deep breaths, and reminded myself of all the harebrained schemes Rennie had gotten into, and how I had got her out of them. I could figure this out, as long as I stayed calm. In an attempt to do so, I reviewed what I knew thus far. Touch and smell had offered useful, yet limited information. After careful consideration, I concluded that more clues were needed. I listened carefully for the telltale sounds of Charlie's place. There were none. The more sounds I registered, the quicker my heart beat. The creaks of the house that I had barely begun to adjust to were unfamiliar. In fact, nothing seemed to resemble Charlie's home except the pitter-patter sound of rain against a window. Straining my hearing, there were sounds like people walking around in a house, but their treads were not Charlie's. Even stranger, I could vaguely hear the voices of a woman and two children. This new information shook me up, which caused me to pull the covers over my head. Doing so caused me to freeze. None of the smells my nose picked up were familiar to me. The sheets had a different detergent. Even the smells from my body were unrecognizable. Furthermore, as odd as it sounded, my body felt strange, like it was the wrong shape and size. A tear began to form at the corner of my eye as my mind attempted to compute what this might mean. My only hope at this point was that I was not dead. The more my mind categorized and the more foreign the space I was in seemed, the intensified heartbeats were joined with my chest being increasingly squeezed and progressively more ragged breathing. Taking intentionally slow breaths, I attempted once more to calm myself, as getting more upset wouldn't help matters. If I had kept my mother alive and housed, I could handle whatever was happening. There had to be an explanation, no matter how inconceivable it might be. Wanting answers more than I wanted to cry, I reforced my mind to focus on solving the problem. The next rational step was to learn more by gathering further information. Unfortunately, I had learned all that was possible through touch, smell, and sound. Yet, the information gathered had only been frightening. Disparagingly, that only left sight. Yet, I didn't want to take that step, as if doing so would make or break the situation. Lying in bed pretending to still be at Charlie's was tempting. Despite my fear, I found the courage to slowly open my eyes. My first reaction was to freeze as my jaw dropped open. I was absolutely certainly not in my room. No reasonable or rational explanation came to mind. Furthermore, this ruined many of the more appealing fictional options. As each minute passed, my eyes kept surveying the space, as if hoping that the next visual pass would magic me back to Charlie's. A hysterical laugh started in my chest, but I immediately squashed it and gave myself a stern scolding. This was not the time or place to freak out. Reminding myself again of the fortune of living with my dear mother had given me ample experiences in being forced into unexpected, unexplainable, distressing situations. Taking some deep breaths and forcing my breathing to be even once more helped tremendously, even though it did not change the situation. I could freak out later. First was problem solving and generating potential solutions. Upon further evaluation, the size of the room wasn't terribly dissimilar to my space at Charlie's. The most startling differences were its shape along with the windows, doors, and closet in dissimilar locations. Not to mention that my room was decorated nothing like this one. Instead of a purple comforter, on top of me was a collection of unfamiliar blankets. The paint on the walls was a grayish white, but cracking like no one had thought to repaint since the house was built. The window was framed by wood that looked worse for wear and had a clearish single pane, rather than the white heavy near plastic frame with double pane at Charlie's. There was a dresser and desk with a chair, but all three items were completely different than mine. Where the dresser at Charlie's had been a dark wood that looked 100 years old, this one was white and slick. It reminded me of something I had seen in the store IKEA that Rennie had dragged me to once. The desk was narrower and wider with less drawers than the one at Charlie's. The similarities yet not quite rightness of the space both increased my terror and gave me hope that there could be a reasonable explanation. Examining the space with a more critical eye, it didn't take me long to notice that the window was open a crack. For an odd reason, the idea of the outside cold air being able to enter the room repulsed me. It was like a homing beacon for a problem easily remedied. As I moved to get up and close it, my hand entered my field of vision. My eyes flicked downward a second time since the first glance seemed too unreal. Officially, there were no rationales left. The desire to completely freak out increased significantly, but I pushed it back down as best as I could. Often as my mother's daughter, I had the sense of being Sherlock Holmes attempting to make sense out of disorder. His quote, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth," came to mind, offering me a sliver of comfort. The truth of the situation could not be found unless I was calm and used the same reasoning skills he did. I might not like his stories as much as the Bront sisters, but there were moments when he had been more helpful to me. Scrutinizing the arm that had moved to close the window, it was obvious that it was not my own. Rather than the near-translucent skin I was born with, my hand looked like it was 3 shades darker than Jake's skin tone. My mind looped, as if stuck on a horrible repeat, while I quickly scrambled out the bed on the side closest to the window and closed it roughly. Doing so solved my immediate problem, while highlighting the wrongness of the emotions. More frightened than I had been since this whole episode had begun, I took a step backwards, as if the window were jinxed. Moving backward across the room, my back and heels hit an obstacle. I made the mistake of turning around. Behind the short dresser, my eyes encountered a mirror with a stranger looking back at me. Static filled my ears. My head felt like it was about to explode. And my eyes filled with tears. Simultaneously, I screamed. The door slammed against a dresser. "What's wrong?" a deep voice asked me. Despite my terror and absolute disbelief, I turned slightly towards the direction the sound had come from, which was to my right, like I couldn't help but watch a train wreck. My brain told me to close my eyes and hide from whatever I would find, but my body refused to abide, as if it was controlled by another force. There in the doorway stood a fairly large man with coffee bean-colored skin. Examining him more closely, I realized that he looked vaguely familiar. He had on a uniform that suggested that he was a Forks deputy. His body had the similar stance to Charlie when he was running towards danger and waiting to find out how he was needed. The familiarity in the uniform with the stance assured me, allowing me to easily come to the conclusion that he meant me no harm. It also confirmed that I was still in Forks, maybe an alternate reality version, but still. Feeling safer, my mind began to once more go through the possibilities of what was happening to me. Without intending to, my eyes went back to the mirror. I looked somewhat similar to the man in the doorway. Where his face was round, mine was a bit more oval. My cheekbones were slightly higher and more pronounced than his. My nose was smaller and somewhat less wide as his. And my skin was at least 2 shades lighter, but there was no mistaking the reality that I looked like I was his daughter. Had I imagined Charlie and Rennie being my parents? Was this a dream? Certainly it couldn't be body snatching. The movie Freaky Friday came to mind, and I rejected that possibility almost immediately. That kind of stuff didn't happen in real life. Then, a part of me remembered Edward and his siblings from school and how otherworldly they seemed. Perhaps Forks was enchanted in some way that made fiction become fact. The possibility that I had been body swapped sounded much more hopeful than body snatching, so despite the ridiculousness of it, I clung to the idea. My thoughts awhirl and my jaw still open wide, the man in the doorway asked, concerned, with a touch of exasperation, "Jamerica, what was there to say?" "Sorry, sir, my best guess is that I might have woken up in your house in your daughter's body and am freaking out." "Nope. Definitely not saying that, especially to a cop." "Spider," I whispered, my voice coming out raspy. He sighed like he was irritated but looked loving and indulgent. "Come on, girl," he insisted. "You've got to get ready for school, and I've got to start my shift." Muz already left for the hospital, after wrangling Martin and Damien herself, as she was asked to come in early. "We let you sleep through doing your morning chores and helping your Massachusetts out, but no daughter of mine is lounging in bed all day instead of going to school." When I remained frozen in place, his voice deepened and his authority came through clear. "God help me, get your behind in gear. Whether you're ready or not, I'm dropping you off at school. We're leaving in 15 minutes. Forcing this body to give a slight nod, as I could muster anything more, he huffed and moved away, closing the door behind him. Unsure of what else to do, along with being fearful that he would follow through in his threat, I forced this body to take steps away from the mirror and towards what appeared to be a closet. Fortunately, opening the door revealed clothes. After some rummaging, I found jeans and a hoodie. Then, I looked into the dresser and found a shirt. Looking down, I was instantly appreciative that this body already had undergarments on, thong or not. Not only was I completely uncomfortable with touching this body, it was at least 2 cup sizes bigger than me, and I was in no mood to figure out how to put someone else's breasts into a bra properly. Avoiding the mirror, I peeled off the sleepwear and put on the clothes. Feeling a little more comfortable in my own style, I didn't even attempt to figure out what to do with the hair. I had no idea where to even start. This body was taller than me and had a more hourglass shape and was more filled out everywhere, despite appearing fairly fit. Thus, even though the clothes were my style, they looked completely different than my usual, as I took one quick glance at the mirror before collecting my courage to leave the room. Examining the room for a bag, I found one next to the desk zipped up. Grateful for small mercies, I grabbed it. Stepping into the hall, I tried to find the kitchen. Like Charlie's place, it ended up being downstairs. Without words passing between us, this deputy handed me some toast and a jacket as he opened the front door, clearly expecting me to step outside. Biting into the toast so to keep the silence going, I stepped gingerly, since ice had covered nearly every surface. Once at the car, I slid into the passenger seat. Look, he started with a sigh, like he was beyond tired, while he pulled out of the drive. I know things have been rough recently. Your mother and I wish we could protect you from everything, but we can't. It's been hard on me too, losing your grandmother. But being mad at the world and acting like you want to crawl out of your skin isn't the answer. Make her proud by being proud of who you are, your heritage, and your family. That's how you honor her. She would want you to live your life to the fullest and was proud of the Quilut heritage within you. I can easily imagine her telling me at times in my life that the people you thought were friends treating you poorly is a reflection of them and not you. While he spoke, my eyes roamed the vehicle, coming to the conclusion that there were little differences between his cruiser and Charlie's. It's not that I wasn't listening, per se. More, it was like I was overhearing a conversation not meant for me. Sure, I could piece some things together, but I was missing significant subtext. It resulted in me being frustrated, sad, and tired. I just wanted to go back to sleep and wake up in my body. I closed my eyes tightly, wishing to be myself again, but nothing changed. The car stopped. Opening my eyes revealed that her had pulled over a block away from the school. He sighed heavily a second time, like he was exasperated. Turning slightly to look at me, he insisted, "You can be angry. Injustice is infuriating. Life isn't fair." I get it. I do, but don't forget to be proud of who you are. You have done nothing wrong. Your grandmother didn't leave you. She loved you dearly and would have stayed if she could. It was simply her time to join the ancestors. And even if Mandy is one of your oldest friends, her lack of compassion and understanding is on her. Anyone who cannot see what an amazing person you are isn't worth your friendship. Not knowing what else to say, I replied with a soft okay. He looked at me warily and with suspicion. Saying nothing more, he turned toward the front and drove the cruiser the short distance into the school's parking lot. "No more sleeping in," he told me as I opened the door. "We've given you as much leeway as we can. It's not fair, but your mom and I need your help." Nodding in consent, as that seemed to be the right thing to do given the circumstances, not to mention that I understood the need to help out in a family. Hadn't I done that for Rennie and then Charlie? As I got out of the car and the cruiser turned the corner, it dawned on me that I was here earlier than most students. Deciding to get out of the cold, I started walking in the direction of the library. My feet might have been walking towards the warmth, but my mind was a million miles away. A part of me appreciated his words and how fatherly they had been. Another part missed Charlie, while being mad at how unfatherly he made Charlie look. Charlie cared about me, clearly. He had bought me a truck, for goodness sake. And seeing that I paid Rennie's bills, I knew he had been faithful to pay the child support and sometimes even send extra, which was always appreciated. Nevertheless, none of that had given me the feeling the deputy's words had. He knew his daughter and counseled her. I had never gotten that from either of my parents. These eyes began to fill. It was all too much. I needed respite from the emotional and mental turmoil. Instead, about 10 feet from the entrance of the largest building, which housed the cafeteria, gym, library, and some classrooms, I paused, frozen. I had been so lost in my thoughts that it hadn't come to me until that moment how, despite the ground having snow and ice, I wasn't falling over like some toddler. Sure, I had put on some boots that had been by the front door, but that still didn't completely explain my steady gait. This small minor thing in all that had happened in the last hour or so was a bright spot. A hysterical laugh began to build. Before it was released, the realization of not being me flooded me once more, overwhelming everything else. Usually my emotions were fairly steady, but this whiplash of the last few minutes would have been an empath's worst nightmare. Trying to mentally steady myself once more and not completely freak out, I decided that standing like an imbecile in the middle of the walkway wasn't helping. I had been going to the library, which worked fine, but then what those thoughts resulted in the epiphany that I didn't know this body's class schedule. If I didn't want a psychiatric evaluation, it would probably be best for me to act as if I was Jamerica. Taking this body to my classes seemed like a sure way to garnish attention. So instead of the library, since I couldn't think of any other option, I went to the front office. "Yes, dear Mrs. Co passed me with a terse smile and weary look, like I might just reach across her desk and choke her. Where was the warm welcome I had received? I had always thought Mrs. Hope to be a nice lady, perhaps frazzled by Edward, given her interactions with him on my first day, and over-friendly, given to being too nosy and talkative, but generally nice.
Perhaps the person whose body I inhabited was rude to adults or something, her being a cop's kid. I couldn't imagine that being the case, but from her dad's speech she had been having a hard time with her so-called friends and her grandmother had just died.
It took me a few minutes to find my voice, as being a few inches taller than I was accustomed accompanied with Mrs. Cope's treatment had frozen me once more. It was so strange to see the world from this vantage point. Not knowing how else to get what I wanted, I spoke to Mrs. Cope respectfully, trying to sound demure, making sure to keep my eyes on her desk. I'm having a bad headache today and it's making it hard for me to remember my room numbers. Would you mind printing out my schedule for me? She looked like she wanted to chastise me, but instead huffed loudly like I was a great irritant, printed it out, and handed it to me brusquely with an even longer exhale. Thank you, Mrs. Cope, I appreciate your help, I told her, attempting to maintain my demure tone, before turning and walking out the door. She smiled slightly less tersely, like she was glad I was leaving her office and knew how to behave appropriately, but her eyes followed me like any minute I might turn around and harm her. It was unnerving and upsetting. Glad to leave, I opened the office door and took a few steps towards the sprawling school. I had barely made it 5 steps when there was an ungodly sound of metal screeching. Turning towards the noise, I watched in horror as vehicles shook with the reverberations of crashing into one another. It looked like a mess of metal. There were a few seconds of absolute silence before there was a rush of people, mostly adults, moving towards the blue van. Looking at the scene, it wasn't hard to assume that I would have been right in the van's destination if this body-swapping thing hadn't happened. Hair rose on the back on my neck and a sense like death had walked past me caused this body to shake in fear. Wanting to flee and knowing blood and me didn't mix, along with the bitter cold that the ice had brought, I walked away and went into the library, keeping my head down and trying to hold my breath. The last thing anyone needed was for me to faint or slip and add to the commotion. It was only once I was safely seated in a corner of the library that it dawned on me that this body might not be able to smell blood or faint at it. Walking without falling and not reacting to blood were absolutely not worth this terrible knot in my stomach, the fear of being caught, the uncertainty of how to stay hidden, and the wish to return to what was familiar, even if it did contain my disabilities. Examining the schedule Mrs. Cope had printed out for me, I appreciated finding the name of this body I inhabited. Gazing at the name printing on the page, Jamerica, gave me a vague recollection of the deputy calling me that. Confirmation of what to expect teachers and peers to call me was certainly helpful. Then the name White sat next to Jamerica. At least I knew what name to respond to if a teacher preferred to call students by their last name. Knowing that her father was Deputy White was equally helpful, as it was a name I had heard Charlie say prior. Confirmation that I had encountered someone Charlie worked with was also assuring. Fortunately, there was also a date on the printout on the bottom right-hand corner, which said January 25, 2005. Many of my options of what was happening were eliminated. I had already confirmed that I was in Forks. Great relief began to spread through me. I was still in someone else's body, which was a problem for sure, but decreasing the possibilities seemed to diminish my terror. My instance that my mind considered every option until they were proved false wasn't proving good for my nerves. The fear of getting through the day remained, but some of the other apprehensions I had been carrying since awakening lessened. Knowing a name and schedule seemed like good first steps to unraveling this mystery and hopefully would lead to clues in order to fix the situation, so I could get back to my life. The schedule even labeled her as a sophomore, which meant that she was probably 15 or 16, rather than my 17. No wonder I had been so blindsided by who she was. I hadn't even been in Forks 2 weeks yet, and so had only begun to learn everyone in my classes. Freshmen, sophomores, and even seniors weren't even beginning to register on my radar unless they were a Cullen. Even though having this information mentally comforted me, and overall resulted in me being calmer than I had been, the whole morning was beginning to catch up with me. It was as if the decreased amount of anxiety and fear increased the intensity of my remaining emotions. I was on the verge of tears once more and truthfully barely holding it together. I kept reminding myself of how unhelpful freaking out would be, but the desire to was strong. Being in the library, surrounded by books, helped. It was comforting to be assured that my likes, dislikes, and personality hadn't changed, even if my body, family, house, grade, etc. had. Fortunately, it was more than an hour later when the librarian came back in and told me to go to class. The time had allowed me to pull myself together, stop myself from an emotional breakdown, and even start writing a list of clues. It wasn't a long list, but it helped me have a sense of doing something to fix the situation. When I finally found the right room for Jamerica's science class, the teacher was trying to settle everyone down. A few people in the class looked at me as I came in, and there were sneers, as if my presence brought down their standing. The reaction to her certainly wasn't like being invisible as I had been in Phoenix, or the shiny new toy behavior Forks High students had greeted me with. I had to wonder if more had happened to her other than her falling out from her friends. Although I had certainly observed in Phoenix how popular girls would cut each other down, so that was also a possibility. Either way, obviously her parents were out of the loop. For the first time since arriving in Forks, I seriously considered if moving to Forks had been the wrong move. Of course, I immediately reminded myself that me moving had been for Rennie's benefit rather than mine. In comparison to the students, the teacher only gave me a cursory glance. Unsure if there was assigned seating, I moved towards an open desk in the back. The teacher didn't correct me and I sighed in relief when I sat myself down. Opening my bag, I explored what was in it to take notes. Maybe when I was capable of summoning the courage, I would venture facing Mrs. Cope once more to get my locker number and combination, as there were no textbooks in the bag. Hopefully I would wake up tomorrow in my body and it would be a moot point. The students resumed their conversations about the car accident that I had witnessed. According to the stories I overheard, Tyler had been speeding and hit some cars in the parking lot and had been taken to the hospital via the ambulance. Evidently there were rumors that school might be cancelled. Clearly that wasn't the case, as the bell rang and the principal announced that each class would be 15 minutes shorter than usual to accommodate the morning emergency. As soon as he completed his explanations, the teacher started.
If I thought biology had been a bore, earth science was a test of my patience, since I had passed it easily last year.
Unfortunately, without the text, certain details were lost to me. Even aside from the textbook issue, I was struggling to stay focused in class, as my thoughts kept returning to getting my life back. The part of me that was a good student wanted to focus on my classes, learn the material and be successful. Another, much more snarky part of me argued that logically these were Jamerica's classes. What consequences would there be for me to fail them by middle of the third class English? I decided that my priority was staying hidden until I could undo whatever had been done. Nothing screamed look at me more than a student who was failing a class. Thus, it was to my benefit for the time being to make sure Jamerica didn't flunk her classes. Unfortunately, both English and then math had assigned seating. When each teacher had corrected me, it was with exasperation and frustration, while the students laughed. At least no one made me stand in front of the class and introduce myself, so it could have been worse. Math was a review, so actually helpful, since it wasn't my strongest subject. After math was lunch. Thus far, in each class there had been students that looked at me in disgust, as I had come in the door. I was beginning to wonder what Jamerica had done to deserve their disdain.
Her father had made it seem like it wasn't her fault, and it was more on their end, but parents weren't always aware of high school hierarchy. Not to mention that parents seemed to think the best of their kids, which wasn't always the truth. Between their behaviors and Mrs. Cope's, it seemed to me that Jamerica likely had an attitude problem or something. In the cafeteria I sat at a table by myself close to the students that had been in my classes, figuring I was in the appropriate sophomore section. It was easy to find the Cullens, as they were at their regular table, acting very much like they had those weeks while Edward had been away. Even though their presence caught my eye and I was glad to see Edward still at school, suddenly their mystery and Edward's bizarre behavior seemed unimportant. For a second I thought that Edward looked in my direction when his name passed through my thoughts, like he had done when Jessica spoke his name on that first day, but Edward was one too many mysteries for me.
Reminding myself that whatever was going on with him wasn't my business and I had bigger fish to fry, I put him and his family out of my mind. Even though I was reluctant to do it, since a part of me blanched at the idea of seeing my body and confirming one of my hypotheses, my desire to fix what was happening with me was stronger. Thus, my eyes scanned the room to see if my body existed within the sea of people. My stomach sank and my insides began to turn into a tornado when my eyes moved over to the table where Jessica, Lauren, Mike, Eric, Ben, Angela and myself had usually sat. Feeling like I was going to be sick, my eyes found no one except Angela and Ben. Where had the rest of them gone? Suddenly, my body swapping idea seemed to unravel. Without my body, how would I ever get my life back? What if I couldn't? Jumping up, I ran to the bathroom, momentarily pleased that I didn't trip or fall. Finding a stall in time, I brought back up the little I had eaten. Exhausted to my bones, I tried to find the energy to get up. The bathroom door squeaked open and then the sound of heeled boots echoed against the walls. Being bulimic won't help you catch Mike's eye, some snotty-sounding girl stated through the door. I was appalled at the idea that what was going on with Jamerica was about a guy and Mike no less. It being about her grandmother's death had fit within me more comfortably. Knowing that avoiding the situation wouldn't help, I reminded myself of the need to present myself as if I were Jamerica. My body or not, I had dealt with enough pettiness in Phoenix to know that the only way to handle a person like this was to face them head on. Grunting and weak, I got off the floor, brushed myself off, flushed the toilet and opened the stall door. On the other side was a girl I could only assume was also a sophomore. Her dress, makeup, and movement reminded me a little of Lauren. God, and those clothes, she reprimanded me as if Daho committed some mortal sin. Mike has eyes only for the new girl and before the Jessica. You'll never stand a chance with him. Especially now that she accused and then waved her hand towards me. Woke up feeling sick and came to school anyway, I inserted with heavy sarcasm. Don't try that with me, Jamerica, she responded haughtily, her voice nasally, as if she was trying to mimic Southern California girls. Like, I've known you since we were like in kindergarten together. And for sure, even on a sick day, you'd never leave your place looking like that. It's like you're just trying to dress more like the new girl, thinking that will attract Mike to you.
For reals, I told you that Mike was meant to be with me since the 3rd grade when he helped me up when I fell and had skinned my knee.
You're just a backstabbing bitch trying to take my man. Some best friend you turned out to be, she scoffed. Honestly, right now I have no interest in anything other than getting through this day, so if you'll excuse me, I told her, trying to sound firm but still kind. Picking up my backpack, I walked out while she stood silently with her mouth open watching me go. Finding my way to the nurse, I told her that I had thrown up. She looked at me skeptically. The longer she evaluated me, the more defeated I felt. Eventually, she told me to get up on the cot and reminded me that she'd have to call my parents. At this point, I didn't care. I just wanted the day to end. In a move that was unlike me, I lay down on the cot, closed my eyes and was glad to skip class. It was all too much, and tears started to collect in the corners of my eyes. Would have meant these accusations had some truth, and my situation was because Jamerica wanted to date Mike to ruin so many lives for a guy was a bitter pill I wasn't sure that I could swallow. Trying to be strong exhausted me, let alone trying to manage things on my own. Rennie might have been unpredictable, but none of her crazy schemes could compare. I had lost everything familiar, including my own body. It was something out of the Twilight Zone.
Unable to hold myself together anymore, I shifted to my side, so that my face was towards the wall and cried, attempting the best way possible to muffle my sobs, so that the nurse wouldn't hear.
A while later, steps were coming near me and then a warm hand was on my shoulder.
Neither of your parents can get off work early, but they'll be here at last bell, the nurse stated in a warm tone.
Stay and rest. I excused you from your last class also. Not trusting my voice, I nodded in acknowledgement. It wasn't much later when I felt my eyelids grow heavy, the day's events weighing too much on me. I might have had a flighty mother, a distant father, no friends, an inability to walk without tripping on air, a sense that I didn't fit within the world, but at least it had been mine. It was only in losing everything that I wished for it back. What had seemed like horrible problems and the end of the world were issues that I would welcome at this point. Allowing my eyelids to close, I prayed, even though God had been a ridiculous concept prior, that I would be Isabella Maria Swan when I woke up. Mornings always sucked. If I could lay in bed enjoying waking up, maybe it wouldn't be so bad, but that's not my life. Instead, my life is full of marching to my mother's tune. She says jump, and I'm supposed to say how high it's all day shit, but I keep reminding myself that I'm almost a junior. That's so close to being a senior. 2 years is forever, especially living my life, so every morning sucks, but better to look at the bright side. Once my brain began to power on, I got nervous. The sounds around me were way different than normal, like so completely different that I started freaking the fuck out. There was no annoying little brother stompings or complainings or arguings. Bizarrely, there were no voices at all. My house was never quiet. It was like I had died in my sleep and hadn't realized it. The silence became deafening, like a bass of a song, drowning out everything else. My heart sped up, my breath quickened, my ears rung, and my throat began to close. Covering my head with the blanket, as if it could protect me, I prayed it would stop. Instead, everything became worse. The texture was too soft, the weight too heavy. Daring to open my eyes a small amount, the slightly sliver of light entered the cocoon I had created. The fabric staring back at me was purple. I hated purple. I would never in a million years own a purple comforter, let alone one that looked so new. All my covers were handmade family throw-offs, because my parents couldn't be bothered to give me what was needed to decorate my room. But even if they had, it would have never been purple. Ugh. Throwing off the cover and sheets in disgust, as if they would contaminate me, I jumped out of bed, moving myself as far away from the offending item as possible. At least that was how it went in my head.
In reality, my foot got tangled in the sheets and I ended up face planting onto the floor, letting out a fairly loud whelp, as my head, chest, and knee hit the ground.
The sheet and blanket imprisoning me were no help as protection. Laying on the ground, my pride in tatters, evaluating all the places my body was screaming at me, I was unable to avert my eyes. They focused on the wood pressing against my forehead, examining it in only the way that could be possible when it's almost against your eyeball. The only thing recognizable was dust, but then even that was wrong. Goosebumps rolled over my body, my breathing became short and labored, and the ringing in my ears increased. Chancing a glance to the left made the situation worse. I screamed in pure terror while trying to crawl away from the floor and this nightmare. Instead, I was stuck. My arms had no strength and the covers were like a vice grip keeping me in place. My screams turned into frustration coated in fear. What was happening to me? Where was I? How did I end up here? I was freaking the fuck out. Could it be a zombie apocalypse, vampire voodoo taken to an alternative reality, body swap? With that thought, my mind stopped spinning and a huge grin spread across my face. Any hope I had was instantly washed away with the sound of heavy boots traveled closer to me. My heart, which had barely calmed, slided, raced even harder, my breathing became even more shallow and my throat closed entirely. I was prone on the floor with no way to protect myself from the impending doom. What was I going to do? What if the person approaching quickly was a serial killer, creepy old man who liked young girls? The possibilities were endless and my brain conjured one worse possibility after another. As my mind raced, my body was frozen, interfering with any desire to hide under the bed. Frantically I tried to figure out what to do as the steps drew nearer. A loud brisk knock pounded the door and echoed in reverberation, scaring me even more. "You all right in there?" the voice on the other side of the door asked, sounding concerned in a fatherly way. The fact that the steps stopped calmed me a little. Not entering was a positive omen. Knocking was even better. Perhaps I stood some chance to survive this encounter. The qualities in the voice were similar to my father, giving my freak-out pause. On top of that, the voice sounded familiar.
It was hard to tell with the door between us, but I wanted it to be Chief Swan, as that would mean that Grandmama had granted me my heart's desire.
All worries left me like water rushing down a drain. Shock mixed with exuberance filled me up. For the second time, hope appeared. The voice being Chief Swan would be evidence that the spell Leah and I had cast had come true. Sure, I had hoped that it might work, but never in a million years had I expected it to. First off, contrary to current evidence, I didn't believe magic existed, despite what my mother kept telling me. Second, the stories my father told were that stories rather than historical depictions. The reality that I needed to rethink the fundamentals of how the world worked caused my brain to race and my legs to begin vibrating. Good thing I was currently well acquainted with the floor.
Before my mind could go too far down that rabbit hole, and admit my mother might be right, the series of events since waking hit me.
The head spell worked for reals. I was Bella Swan. I desired to jump up and down, celebrating, but couldn't given my predicament. What an idiot I was being. Not only was there no reason to be scared, all the strangeness since awakening was confirmation of my success. If it had been possible, I would have slapped myself on the forehead. But since my arms were still trapped from my fall, I could only give myself a mental slap. "Everything okay?" the voice on the other side of the door asked once more. After a brief moment of confusion, I realized that I hadn't answered him the first time. "Got it covered," I answered, while attempting to hide my jubilant laughter. Nothing more was said from the other side of the door, although the boots could be heard moving further away from me. Guess my answer had worked. It was strange that he hadn't come in. My father certainly would have. It worked in my favor though, as it gave me some time to put myself together. With some concentration and effort I got myself unwrapped from the covers and off the floor. While doing so my brain conjured scary options, like the spell had worked but something had gone wrong, like it also sent me back 100 years. Needing confirmation of my true success, for the first time I looked down at my hands, confirming that I had pale skin. Upon further examination, I verified that this body was female. The clothes on this body looked fairly modern, so that was good. I looked for a mirror in order to triple check that I was indeed in Bella's body, but found no mirrors. What girl didn't have a mirror in her room? Not even trying to solve that puzzle, I determined that there had to be one in the bathroom. There might not have been a mirror, but there was a computer.
Wanting to check the date, since her alarm only had the time, I first made sure the covers didn't harm me once more, then walked over to the computer and turned it on. Since it would take the computer time to boot, I carefully opened the door the knock had come from, checked that no other soul was there, and then stealthily moved to the left, hoping that like in my house it would lead to my desired destination. Opening the door and peering in, I was pleased to see that my guess had been correct. Going over to the mirror, I examined the reflection. Smiling widely, I started shrieking in excitement. I had successfully become Bella Swan, newest addition to the junior class. She was Fork's version of a shiny new toy and totally acting like it was his burden. Heavy boots came up the stairs, although at a slower pace than last time. "You okay there, Bells?" his voice called out to me, even though he was physically not able to see me yet. "I'm great," I exclaimed. "Okay then," he muttered with irritation and confusion, while he moved back down the stairs. Closing the door in case he came up again, I began to look closely at the face staring back at me. Even though this was everything I prayed for, it was strange to see the veins running through my skin to be shorter, less curvy and more petite. I didn't look like me. Even though that was the point, it was beyond startling. The spell had been such a far-fetched idea.
Despite seeing the evidence, it wasn't sinking in. The excitement was tampered with a holy fuck it worked. My own disbelief in magic was only superseded by Lee's. Not only had she been extremely skeptical, she had endured even more lectures about the dangers of messing with unknown forces from her mother than I had with mine. When I had talked to her about my idea, she had first stated that it was a bunch of superstitious nonsense, and then repeated her mother's warnings. Despite all her hesitancies and concerns, her being able to win back Sam had clenched the deal for her. Excited to share my news with her, I went to run downstairs and call her. Just shy of the railing, I stopped myself. Did Bella even know Leah? Could a phone call make Chief Swan suspicious, or worse, Auntie Sue holding on to the top of the handrail, trying to decide what to do? I couldn't come up with an excuse that would be believable to either of them, if Bella was a virtual stranger to Leah. Auntie Sue was annoying good at being able to see through Leah especially, but me too. And if she found out, she'd tell Harry, who would tell the rest of the elders, and then they'd force us to undo the spell, since they probably knew the antidote. And Leah wouldn't get her chance. They were so annoying, all up in everyone's business. Ugh. And I would never betray Leah like that. For her sake as well as mine, I needed to take my grandmama's advice and think things through before I acted. The spell actually working seemed so far-fetched that we hadn't made plans if it did. That had been foolish of us. My grandmama's laughter and words telling me that I needed to not rush headlong into action came to me, causing me to smile. Like clockwork, my response to her warning had been, and what would be the fun in it? She would then laugh and shake her head, while telling me, one day your fun is going to cost you a pretty penny. Nah, Daho tease back. Don't you know nothing can touch me?
Shed smiley sad kind of smile that seemed to contain longing and sadness, which made no kind of sense to me.
God, I missed her. Life wasn't horrid and drab without her. Without Mike I would have never left my bed. Like many things between grandmama and I, even though the years passed, we repeated the same phrases, enjoying the banter. She was the lighthouse in my storm. She was the place of refuge I could count on until she wasn't there anymore. It wasn't like I didn't know she was old, but she wasn't supposed to leave me. Not yet. The last time I saw her, she told me in a whisper, even when I'm not here to give you a hug, I'll always be with you, while she coughed almost every syllable. Until waking up in Bella Swan's body, I was certain she had been wrong. How could she be with me? It wasn't possible. She was dead. Everything was different this morning, even my beliefs. Without doubt she had been looking after me. She was certainly the one that had made the spell work. She always wanted the best for me. She was blessing me, even if I hadn't thought it all the way through, following through with her promise.
The best way I could honor her life, her love for me, and this gift would be to enjoy it, and use it as intended.
Returning to the bathroom, I decided that time is critical to come up with a way around Auntie Sue and Chief Swan. Staring at the reflection, I thanked my grandmama once more. The smile staring back at me was wider than anything, but there was some sadness in the eyes. My grandmama's death flashed before me. Don't dwell on sad things, baby girl, she had told me. She had never steered me wrong, so I tried to shake off the desire to cry and focused on her amazing gift of staring at Bella Swan's face. Getting dressed seemed smart since, all going to plan, today was a school day. Returning to the bedroom and closing the door, I first went over to the computer. Opening the calendar program, I confirmed that it was the morning after we had conducted the spell. With the concern solved, I tried to figure out what to wear and focused on the good, starting with the good parts of being Bella Swan. It didn't take much for my smile to return and widen even further than it had been before.
Not only was she the chief's daughter, she was an only child, so no mother around to nag me, no siblings to take care of and break my stuff, and most importantly, nothing impeding Mike's interest in me.
A few minutes later I heard Chief Swan yell up, heading to work. Drive safe, it's icy out. Thanks, I yelled back, even if I wasn't sure he heard me. Seemed the polite thing to do. Good to know that he wasn't a rotten dad. No one could beat mine though. Recalling everything I knew about regarding Chief Swan didn't amount to much. His best friends were Lee's dad, Uncle Harry, and Jacob's dad, Mr. Bill. He liked to fish with them, and even though he talked about Bella, it didn't seem like he visited her often, and I couldn't remember her ever staying with him before her big move. None of that seemed helpful in what was bound to happen, what to say when I actually saw him face to face. It was one thing for Leah and I to talk about the spell. It was another to be living it. And clearly we had missed some critical elements. Refusing to become bummed, I focused on preparing for school. Rummaging through Bella's closet resulted in a lot of shirts and hoodies. She was skinny like an actress's and probably a 00 or something. A body like what I had seen in the mirror was worth showing off. Maybe she covered it up because she was self-conscious or something. Well, I wasn't. Trying to pick something that was at least remotely decent was beyond difficult. Her options were so terrible. My searching made it obvious that I needed to convince the chief to hand over money for clothes. The question was how. Before the thought went too far, it dawned on me that Chief Swan had just left telling me to be careful driving to school. I started freaking out, since I didn't even have my permit yet. Reminding myself of the good once more, I focused on getting dressed and out the door, figuring that I could freak out about driving once I was behind the wheel. Finally finding one remotely adequate outfit, I put it together. It took me heading to the bathroom to discover why Bella never wore heels, even as small as the ones on the boots that I had found in the very back of the closet. She was clumsy almost to the point of it being a disability. I hoped it wasn't a quality that Mike would find attractive, because I was planning on curing the junk. No way was I walking around in Converses.
It took me a bit to realize that her bathroom stuff wasn't in the bathroom, which seemed dumb to me, but it wasn't my family or house.
Going back to her bedroom, I found a bag that looked like a guy's shaving kit. Not seeing anything else, I looked inside. Sure enough, there was a toothbrush, deodorant, and other essentials. Not sure about how I felt using someone else's personal body things, I decided to anyway, since it was her body and her stuff. By the time I was ready to leave, applying what little makeup she owned, I was in high spirits once more.
My body was nearly shaking in excitement, I had a huge grin, and I kept wanting to jump up and down, so much so that I kept telling myself I needed to play it cool, since Bella wasn't a very animated person from what I had observed.
If I was honest, my last thought as I gave myself one last look over before I exited the bathroom was that I looked better than she usually did.
It took me a few minutes to find the kitchen, and then something edible, but eventually Pop-Tarts became my breakfast and I walked outside. As soon as I opened the front door, I shut it, chastising myself for forgetting forks weather in my exuberance.
Tracking down a jacket, scarf, hat, and gloves wasn't too hard, but certainly meant I was going to be late to school. Would being the chief's daughter that Mrs. Cope would be more or less strict about attendance. There was no way to know, so I focused on the garments I found to keep myself warm. Unlike mine, hers weren't pretty, but at least they were snuggly. Maybe I had found something my parents were better at than Chief Swan. They clothed me properly. Opening the door once more, I moved slowly, as the rain from last night had frozen, making everything a sheet of ice. Focusing on not falling had stopped me from freaking out. Locking the door behind me, I eventually made it to Bella's truck. All of my excitement was sucked out of me and replaced with terror. Turning it on was easy enough, but I struggled to convince myself to actually drive. Sure, my dad had given me a few lessons, but that wasn't the same as being on my own behind the wheel. His words reminded me that vehicles can become weapons if not treated with respect, repeated like a broken record in my head. But it wasn't like I was going to walk when she had a truck. With Grandmama's encouragement in my ear, eventually I convinced myself that as long as I took my time, I could safely drive to school. The engine was ridiculously loud, but it drove well enough. In my fear, I kept the speed below 10, and it barely hit 5 when I was backing up. The whole time I had my dad's voice in my head reminding me to keep my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and to keep the left side of the truck's hood on the middle line, and to pay attention to potential hazards. I had missed seeing him this morning, so his instructions helping me get to school gave me a sense that he was still looking out for me, which soothed some of my sadness. When I arrived, there were police vehicles and an ambulance hauling someone away. Any anxiety I had about being late was replaced with worry about what had happened. This kind of excitement was rare in Forks. It took a bit of waiting until an officer, Deputy Stevenson, directed me around the mess and into a parking spot. Turning off the engine, I moved the rearview mirror to check myself out one more time, since there was no mirror behind the sunscreen, and then I went to find Mike. I was barely at the truck's tailgate when Jessica, a girl who hung out with Mike, came towards me, moving relatively quickly, given the ice that coated every surface. "Oh, thank goodness you're okay," she squealed once she reached me. "Just running late," I explained, confused as to why she might be concerned. "I drove extra slow cause of the ice," I added as she seemed to be waiting for me to say something, but I wasn't sure what. Her tone changed to one that sounded as if she were conspiring with me. "Well, Tyler lost control and ran into a number of cars, mine included." The glint in her eye reminded me of the one Dawn got when she got to tell me information that she was certain I didn't know. Then her tone changed again to something slightly less high-pitched. "In fact, for a minute I thought maybe he had hit yours, since he stopped right where you have been parking," she declared to me, talking so fast I had to wonder if she knew any speed of speech other than rapid. Suddenly she frowned and she slowed down a bit. "A bunch of us are going over to the hospital to make sure Tyler's okay and everything. If you want to go, maybe I could ride with, since my car is in that mess somewhere." "Sure," I told her, working at keeping in the broad grin that wanted to spread and turning it into a frown, reminding myself that Bella would have been sad or worried about Tyler. Not only had my spell worked, but it was like the day had become my dream come true. The excitement from before began to return until I got into the driver's seat once more. It was quickly replaced by terror. My throat closed and my heart crashed into my stomach, threatening to spill its contents on my lap. Driving where people were watching me was 1,000 times worse than when I had been alone. Taking a deep breath, I reminded myself of all that I had done to safely arrive at school. Once Jessica was seated and buckled, I told her, my mom's car was small, so I'm not used to this monster. Could you check too? I don't want to hit anyone. Sure, she answered very bubbly, making me wonder if she dialed it down ever. Maybe she only knew how to exist in the world in a hyper-fast state, or maybe it was the result of watching the crash. Pops and I had only practiced reversing once. Luckily his words were cemented in my mind. Like everything else about driving thus far, it took my whole concentration.
Even though I was afraid Jessica would say something about how slow I had backed up, she didn't seem surprised or upset about it, so I guessed that I did all right and warning her had been the right move.
Backing up with all the cars and people was completely the worst. Nothing from my practice with my dad made it easier. At the parking lot exit my father was directing traffic and didn't even give me a second glance. Taking in a harsh breath to stop myself from crying, I refused to be weak. I was following my happiness. If anyone had supported me living out grandmama's gift, it would have been him. I tried to stem the sadness that was rising by reminding myself that even though I hadn't expected the spell to work, any dummy would have worked out that I couldn't stay his little girl and swap with Bella. I couldn't stay his little girl much longer anyway, so it wasn't like I sacrificed a ton. Between my pep talk and reminders that I was dwelling within Bella Swan's body, the sadness receded. It was only once we were almost to the hospital when I remembered that Bella seemed like she was friends with Jessica and that any fool could tell that Jessica was dog of her Mike. By going after Mike, Bella and Jessica's friendship might be at jeopardy. Mulling it over, I decided that no one would catch on to the swap if Jessica and Bella had a falling out. And it wasn't like she was my friend, she was Bella's. So, it really wasn't any skin off my nose. The important part was to make sure nothing gave me away. The spell working was clear evidence in my belief that Mike and I were meant to be together. I was determined to make my grandmama proud. And it was obvious that living happily ever after was way more important to my grandmama than keeping my family or my friends. My old ones are the ones Bella had made. Finding a place to park in the hospital garage, Jessica and I walked together into the waiting room, where nearly the whole junior class, along with students from other classes, had congregated. All clumped together with Mike were 2 other girls and 2 other boys. As Jessica and I walked over to them, I grew nervous but refused to appear anything other than calm and collected. We were almost to them when someone yelled out, "Bella." I would have kept walking except Jessica pulled on me. Turning to her, she declared, "Bella, your dad is calling for you." Oh, okay, thanks. Clearly, I needed to start answering to Bella before someone found out. Stopping my progression, I turned around, unsure of where he was coming from. Right then he reached me. Putting his hands on the top of my arms, he asked me with worry and urgency in his tone, "You alright?" "Perfect," I told him with a smile. He looked relieved, yet eyed me carefully. I drove super slow to school, so it was already over by the time I got there, I informed him. Pursing my lips, I had to hope that I hadn't said anything to give myself away. "Good," he stated strongly, relaxing somewhat. Moving away, he informed me I might be home late. "Don't worry about dinner for me." Okay, I agreed easily, relieved he wasn't upset about me being late to school and pleased to learn the information that Bella was usually the cook. Although the cooking part worried me since I was no good at it. My mother had attempted to teach me and I had found it irritating. There had to be a way to get out of that responsibility, as it definitely would blow my cover. Once Chief Swan began making his way through the people, I went over to Mike and his friends. "Hey," I told them, making sure to keep eye contact with Mike. "You guys all okay?" I asked, trying to sound genuinely concerned. "God, I could have died," Lauren wailed. It was terrifying. He slammed on the brakes. You could hear them squealing and the tires burning, and then the tremendous crash. Then, everyone was screaming and trying to get to Tyler. "Sounds like I should have arrived earlier," I told them playfully, adding a smile for good measure. My joke seemed to fall flat as no one smiled. I looked down, trying to keep an eye on Mike's expression. "It was unreal," one of the boys added after a second, saving me from humiliation, like the world sped down and then sped up. "It was wicked." "I thought that was just me," Mike added, looking like he was feeling a little sick. Moving closer to him, I put my hand on his arm. Making sure to sound empathic and concerned, I told him, "I'm sure it was traumatic." Focusing on Mike, I was only half listening to everyone else. "They're bringing in counselors for everyone," one of the other girls told us. "No way," Jessica retorted. "I think so," the girl added. "I overheard some of the staff talking about it." Well, then, we should leave before they expect me to smear my mascara, Lauren stated with authority. We should wait to hear from Drive. Cullen about Tyler, the second male put in. Looking at Mike, I watched to see what he wanted to do. I was totally in for skipping school and having fun, but reminded myself of my grandmama's advice to think things through first. It took a bit, but I could see Mike really wanting to wait to make sure his friend was okay. He really was a great guy. Fine, Lauren retorted nasally. But as soon as Dr. Dreamy comes out, we're going. No one said anything, but Mike's body relaxed, which was good enough for me.
I was glad to know that Lauren had a lot of sway in the group, especially since I would have thought from watching the group at lunch that role would have gone to Jessica.
It just showed that even though we all knew of each other, we didn't really know each other. After a bit, some other people cleared out and our group was able to sit down on uncomfortable hospital waiting chairs. Luckily, I managed to stick by Mike's side, offering him comfort when it seemed appropriate. It took some more time, which the group used by each person retelling their perspective of the accident before Drive. Cullen came out. Honestly, by the time Angela said, "Yeah, it was scary," I was ready to scream. It was just the same thing basically over and over. It's not like someone died or anything. Let them lose the most important person in their life and then have them complain. In comparison to my loss, their fear seemed misplaced and childish. Drive. Cullen cleared his throat rather loudly, "If you ask me," and then told the room, "Those of you here for Tyler, please know that he's not in any danger and being well attended to. There will be no visitors for him except his direct family. Thank you."
With spells being a thing, Dad's stories were clearly a thing, and no more evidence was needed in support than Drive.
Cullen. He clearly wasn't human. He didn't scare me or anything, but his whole appearance was way too beautiful and composed. After a moment, Angela told everyone, "I need to get back to class." "I'll drive you," Ben offered. "Thanks," she told him and smiled back. They seemed like they were into one another. I had to wonder if they were a couple.
No one had mentioned anything about it, and I hadn't seen the two of them hold hands or anything, but then some couples were more private about those kinds of things.
I wouldn't be. I would hold Mike's hand everywhere and anytime he let me. "I'm going home to recover from 2 days' awfulness," Lauren informed us. "You all should come over." I took my focus off of Mike to notice how the group would respond, as it would say a lot about their dynamics. Clearly Angela and Ben were goody two-shoes, but then again Angela was the Reverend's daughter. "Sounds good to me," Jessica put in. "Me too," added Eric. Mike turned to me, "What about you, Bella?" "I'm thinking going sounds good," I told him truthfully, excited he asked me and hoping he and I were on the same page. "I'm in," Mike added. Unable to help myself from smiling, I tried to not be too obvious. After arranging transportation, we all left the hospital and headed over to Lauren's, except Angela and Ben, of course. Jessica rode with me again and directed me to Lauren's house. It didn't take long after Wed arrived to realize that it was lunchtime and we were all hungry. Jessica and I went about making everyone sandwiches, while Lauren found some soda and chips. Everyone was nearly done when Eric asked, "What now?" "I've got some video games," Lauren offered. The guys got excited and us girls just rolled our eyes. After dumping our plates into the kitchen, she set up the system and the boys played while we watched. When Wed had enough of watching them, she asked, "How about Twister?" "Sure," nearly everyone said at once. The first couple of callers were no big deal, but once we had 3 points down, everyone was touching everyone else. I could feel Mike at every place where our bodies were connected. Officially, this day was turning into the very best of my life. Purposefully or not, I couldn't tell, Mike's elbow moved over my breast. It didn't take much after that for me to fall down and be out, but it was the icing on a great cake. When Eric won, I went to the kitchen to get some more soda and looked at the clock. Chief Swan had said that he'd be home after dinner, but did I have a curfew? I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to get grounded. Maybe there was a second downside if Bella's father was stricter than my parents. I should go, I told the group, as staying in Chief Swan's good graces seemed wise. As the words exited my mouth, I could nearly feel my grandmama squeezing my hand in encouragement. "You willing to give me a ride to my place?" Bella Mike asked. "Sure," I told him, beaming. Out the corner of my eye I could see Jessica seething, which confirmed my guess that she was into Mike. After we both said goodbye to everyone, Mike and I got into the truck's cab. Even though he said nothing, it seemed like he wanted to grab my hand but constrained himself. I wanted to make the first move but didn't. Not only did it sound slutty, Leah had warned me against it. Still, it was hard to keep my hands on the steering wheel when he was so close. "It was great of you to hang with us," he told me as he pointed out his place. "Yeah, it was fun," I agreed this time, unable to stop the smile from spreading across my face. Once parked, I noticed that he was staring at me, flicking his eyes at my lips. Had he done that throughout the drive, I couldn't help but wonder if he wanted to kiss me. Licking my lips and pursing them a bit, I leaned towards him, putting my hand down between us in order to do so. I wouldn't make the first move, but flirting and encouraging him seemed smart. Placing his hand on top of mine, he leaned towards me. "Thanks for being so great today, Bella," he told me, his voice quivering some. "Anything for you, Mike," I told him, my voice unsteady as well. He might not know the reality of what Daho already done to mean every single word, but I hoped one day he would know the truth in my statement. He looked into my eyes while he leaned in, presumably checking that he had my permission to come closer. He absolutely did, so to encourage him, I leaned in. It took him a few more seconds before his lips found mine. It was like electricity flowed from where our lips were touching down my spine into my fingers and toes and then made a ball of energy in my stomach. It was so energizing, I could have run a mile without breaking a sweat. Mostly though I wanted to scream and shout my happiness from the rooftops.
The kiss barely lasted a breath's length and he hand pressed it hard, but it was the best thing that had ever happened to me in my whole life.
Pulling away from me, he had a million-watt smile. I wore a matching one. If there was any more confirmation that Mike was my path to happiness, I had just received it. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest in a good way. "See you, Bella," he told me as he got out of my truck. High as a kite, I couldn't remember how to drive back to Bella's. It took almost an hour, but eventually I made it, still over the moon. Fortunately, there was no chief swan. Making my way into the kitchen, I made myself something to eat, then opened her backpack to prepare myself for tomorrow. For a second it was as if I was in my home doing my regular. The topics quickly brought me down to earth. My elation plummeted, causing me to wish that I had not even gone there. Somehow this part of her being a grade above me hand crossed my mind. Refusing to let this new downside tarnish a great day, I told myself that it couldn't be that hard.
Starting with the class that I imagined being the easiest, in terms of what lay before me, I opened the English textbook and tried to read the first chapter. Between the content and the memory of Mike's lips on mine, I hardly made any progress. At least it wasn't science or math. When I heard a cruiser pulling up into the drive, I scampered into Bella's room, taking her things, unwilling to deal with the chief. Hopefully he didn't require homework to be done in the kitchen like Massachusetts. He moved around downstairs.
Afraid he would come up, I put the studies away, found some ratty clothes to sleep in, covered myself in blankets, even though it was really too early to go to bed, and closed my eyes, pretending to be asleep with the door opened a crack, like I was required to do at home.
When he did come up, he lingered longer than I thought necessary in the doorframe, but didn't do more, not even step into the room.
Eventually, he turned and headed downstairs, closing the door behind himself. I guess closed doors were permitted her. Good to know. Sleep didn't come easily, my excitement filling me with energy.
Before I had gone ahead with the spell, I was certain that I was irrevocably in love with Mike, and thus, my happiness would be found with him.
Yet there had been doubts that he could love me in return. Lying in the bed staring at the ceiling, it was abundantly clear to me that we were meant to be. As I fell asleep, my mind racing and my heart full, I hoped and prayed like I never had before that I would wake up and be Bella's Swan again tomorrow.
Returning from Denali and facing the call of the blood residing in Isabella Swan was an exercise of resoluteness, but I wasn't going to be chased away from my house and family by blood, irrelevant of the level of desire to consume it. If I could get through my newborn years as a vegetarian by sheer determination and Carlosol's guidance, and then return from my years of being a human hunter to only animals, also due to determination, then I could and would resist the pull to gorge myself on the delectableness that Miss Swan's blood offered me.
It was one of the few things Tanya had said that I agreed with. "It's good to have you home," Carlyle greeted me, while adding mentally, "Are you sure?" Musing to himself, to take the life of an innocent could be his undoing. I don't know how he would recover. He already tortures himself enough with those lives that he did take. "I'm for the challenge," I assured him. "As long as you're sure," he added. I nodded in assurance. Next Asm wrapped me in a hug. "Are you better now? You usually have such good control." I was worried. "The Alaskan air did me good," I assured her. Each of my siblings welcomed me back and mentally asked if I could handle it, except Alice, who didn't share her thoughts at all. Rose was worried about moving and threatened me.
Right before everyone was able to disperse, Emmett blurted out, "You think you got some super control, Edward, but going to school without any precautions seems a recipe for disaster."
Rose appreciated Emmett saying something, while everyone else agreed. Recognizing when I was outnumbered, I walked to the dining room table and sat down. After suggestions were thrown around, the general consensus was that I needed to adjust myself to her scent without her being present. Alice agreed to get an item and Jasper went with her while I groaned in displeasure. They were treating me like Carlyle had as a newborner after I had returned. It was patronizing, yet it came from their care of me, so I humored them. On our way back, Alice warned me. Despite remembering how the scent pulled on me, I still was inadequately prepared when it hit my nose. Without thought, I stood up and started to move towards it. A cacophony of warning and suggestions bombarded me. Consequently, I was able to stop my progress and return to my seat. Edward needs to fix any questions or worries Isabella has, Rosalie insisted. Everyone agreed, myself included, that for the sake of keeping our nature hidden, I needed to dispel any curiosity that Miss Swan had about me. Although I had managed to not kill her and slaughter the class, I had behaved inhumanly. What did you think about you? Jasper asked. I don't know, I answered, her mind is closed to me. The family all reacted in great surprise. My siblings, aside from Alice, were worried that I would be hopeless without my gift. What was clear to me was that without her thoughts to review, I was uncertain how much damage control there was to do. Carlisle and Alice's recommendations seemed the most helpful. Fortunately, after seeing my turmoil, Alice had kept an ear out and watched Miss Swan's future. After much conversation and consultation, it was decided that making plausible human excuses for my appearance and then acting human was the most prudent course of action.
The Monday I returned to Forks High and had seemingly been successful with Miss Swan, although without her thoughts available to me, I couldn't say for certain.
My ability to speak to her cordially at all demonstrated that where there is a will, there is a way. Not to say that it was not without challenge, as the demon that dwelt within me barraged me to enjoy her nectar. Her body gave no indication of fear, she seemed displeased, but generally agreeable and accepting. The only conclusion, therefore, was how shockingly easy it had been to win her over and replace whatever concerns about me she had previously. I was never more grateful for my vampire lures or the dim-wittedness of humans. The only two slight blemishes on the encounter were me calling her Bella rather than Isabella and her question about my eye color. The only true hiccup about the second was that it seemed to indicate that she had an ability to notice details that most humans overlooked. Some humans were more astute than others, and I had kept my nature a secret from them all. So, although reading her mind would have been an assuring confirmation, I was confident in my capacity. My goal was to get through the rest of the school year without increasing her curiosity of me and then ensure we had no classes together senior year. Tuesday morning, my siblings and I arrived at school exactly 10 minutes early, as was our usual pattern. Continuing on as if nothing had changed, we stood together, breathing in the air's mixture of forest, dampness and human in order to prepare ourselves to be surrounded by them for the day. We were chatting about inconsequential things when a vision of Tyler's van skidding across the parking lot due to ice crossed Alice's mind. No one would get hurt except Tyler, so I murmured below the human hearing range to everyone, accident. In uniform, we moved closer together in order to protect each other from giving into our nature. We watched as the van moved of its own accord across the ice and how Tyler's inexperienced response locked the brakes. Consequently, when the tires were off the ice, he had no control over the vehicle. This was not the first time we had witnessed a youth demonstrate the combination of a lack of proper preparation and fear response that culminated in damage. In comparison to others, this was fairly minor. The demon within me whispered how this was an opportune moment to savor Miss Swan's essence. The temptation it brought was a confirmation that my insistence, since returning from Denali, to be constantly aware of Miss Swan's location had been wise. My original purpose behind my tracking her was to ensure while we were in proximity to each other that her blood remained within her body, as my worst possible scenario for our family would be for it to exit its container. Her dilapidated truck hand made an appearance before Alice's vision. The sound alone made it impossible to miss. Nevertheless, as confirmation, I searched for her through Mike, Jessica, Angela and even Lauren's eyes. No Miss Swan was to be found. Some sadness and disappointment filled me. Jasper looked at me sideways and I shrugged back. I couldn't explain my reaction in the least, so focused on the events unfolding, as they were far more important than my strange feelings. As in Alice's vision, Tyler's van hit 3 vehicles that had been parked. His driver's side glass exploded and the scent of his blood began to fill the air. The human's fear altered their blood chemistry and thus sent in a way that called to all of us. Each of my siblings' thoughts was focused on wrangling their own demon back into its cage. Rosalie was the quickest. Her usual tactic was to remind herself that she was in control. In these instances, her vanity was her greatest strength. Both Emmett and Jasper used the images of their disappointed wives. Emmett was quicker than Jasper in his success, but that was to be expected. Alice's visions reminded her the cost of choosing Tyler's death, causing her to be second after Rosalie to bring her true self into the forefront once more. Once able, Alice checked on Jasper through her visions and I watched his thoughts. He was successfully working on it. Let's get inside, I suggested. Everyone's thoughts were in agreement, thus we moved as a group away from the blood and towards the buildings.
Alice saw a room that would work for our purposes, so she and I guided Jasper, Rosalie, and Emmett in that direction.
It wasn't the closest of calls for any of us, including Jasper. However, my encounter with Miss Swan had been an acute reminder of how challenging Jasper's fight against himself could be. The four of us sat in chairs near each other with Jasper somewhat centered between us, listening out for what was happening. Using my gift, I monitored the situation and ensured that no one had been paying attention to us. Every once in a while, I would check that Miss Swan's blood was still contained. She seemed to have arrived late and immediately been ambushed by Jessica, and they had left to go to the hospital.
Her father, Chief Swan, had been one of the first on the scene, searched for her, organized Tyler's removal, checked in with his deputies, and then followed the ambulance.
I relayed it all to my siblings and Alice added the outcomes she could see, including Carlos's decisions. The students' rumors of school being let out for the day were not completely without merit, as we heard some of the staff discussing it. Ultimately, the principal decided to continue on with whatever could be salvaged of the day. Thus, it was not long after the last of the police officers were finished that we could hear the staff ushering the students back into the building. We each looked at the others, checking that we were each in control. Back to the grind, Emmett joked. Standing up, we left Jasper in his class and continued on with our day. The crash could have ended up much worse. Thankfully, the only blood spilled was Tyler's, and his was not particularly appetizing as human blood goes. A bunch of cars being damaged was inconsequential to their survival and us keeping our secret, so a detail none of the family even considered. However, many of the students wondered how their fellow humans would finance the repairs and were worried about how their parents would respond if the same happened to them. It was a morbid relief that their thoughts were on money and paperwork and parents, as it demonstrated our success to keep our demons hidden from them. By lunchtime, the crash was all that the students were speaking about, and nearly all that they were thinking about. Nothing so close to death had happened to the majority of them prior, and it was impacting their sense of safety in the world. As I scanned the thoughts, my gift picked up my name. I briefly looked in the general direction. The person was sitting with the sophomores, so of no importance to us.
Keeping an ear out, and my gift focused on finding the students Miss Swan had sat with at lunch yesterday. Over an hour passed after classes had resumed when I finally picked up Ben and Angela's mental voices. I had heard many of the students' plans to go to the hospital, but since my initial focus had been my siblings, all of those who had sat at the same table as Miss Swan had escaped my notice.
According to Angela's thoughts, Miss Swan went with everyone else from the hospital to Lawrence. They probably were taking advantage of the situation to miss classes. It was a typical response in this generation. Gratefully, that meant that Miss Swan wouldn't be in biology, which was honestly a welcome relief. However, I also experienced a tinge of sadness, which was strange and concerning. There was no reason to miss a human, let alone one whose blood called for me to consume it. Since seemingly the danger of me murdering anyone had passed, I focused my gift on my siblings. The fact that doing so distracted me from my strange emotions was minor in comparison to my desire to ensure a successful day. Jasper was doing fine, seemingly recovered from Tyler's spilled blood, which was a great accomplishment on his part. Rosalie and Emmett were also their usual selves. Alice's thoughts were looping and she seemed to be repeating some similar images over and over, which often in her mind indicated confusion. I made a decision to ask her what was wrong. My visions have been occasionally wonky since about midnight. I had dismissed it as an anomaly and the accident came through clearly, as well as Jasper and my futures, but when I search yours it acts up again. Completely unsure of what wonky might mean, I decided to ask her to give me more information and explain herself. Your future looks like those original televisions when the reception wasn't clear, she explained, and then broadcast to me a vision of me tonight, and her description was apt. It's like your future got messed with, but how would that even be possible? With no clue to aid in her questions, I had no response and began to consider possible explanations.
She had always said that most of life was filled with the little decisions that determined our futures, but some things were just fated, and no matter what decision might be made in the moment, eventually whatever was meant to be would come about.
Seeing through my gift how her gift worked, it was easy to see how she had reached her conclusions, as much as I disliked the idea of fate. Were the distortions in her visions related to decisions or fate, and if it was fate, what could have messed with fate? I spent the rest of the day considering the possibilities but drew no conclusions. I don't know either, Alice informed me as I drove everyone home. It seems like what has been altered impacts you and the rest of the family indirectly as a result. I pondered. I'll keep looking, she assured me. Without doubt she would, as Alice disliked a mystery even more than I did. Do we need a family discussion? I decided to ask her. Perhaps, she mused. As fussed when we got home, concerned over our reactions to the spilled blood as well as the child Tyler. She roped me into making a dish for his parents before she took it over to their home. Once she released me from the chore, I lay on my couch, listening to some Debussy. I replayed the day, continuing to try to help Alice understand what might be impacting her gift. Yet despite my intentions, my mind kept returning to Miss Swan. It was strange that Miss Swan had been late to school, but that was easily explained due to the ice. The visions of her viaduct Jessica before they left the school grounds along with Jessica's thoughts suggested that Miss Swan had put more attention into her appearance than usual. She had some makeup on and according to Jessica had dressed in more form-fitting jeans. Ben and Angela had been worried about Tyler and disappointed, but not surprised that the others in their group had skipped school.
From my brief observations, Miss Swan seemed like a diligent student, so her going to Lawrence with them seemed like an odd choice, but not unexpected, as her trying to fit in was a common teenage pastime.
When Carlisle returned from his shift, Alice called a family meeting and explained her gift's problems. Carlisle's thoughts went in the direction mine had gone, that someone or something had messed with fate. When he ruled out logical possibilities, he considered mythical ones. I raised an eyebrow at him. Just exploring all options, he explained. The others offered ideas, but no one had a true possibility. After a few hours, we separated to engage in our own pursuits. Everyone continued to think about it, albeit amid the least. As the sun rose, the family was no closer to helping Alice. My curiosity on how come it was most apparent in my future only fueled me in my desire to solve the mystery. It was a new day. Unwilling to completely dismiss Carlisle's musings, I decided to look through his books on mythology. Alice did not see it helping, but it was still worth the venture. Despite my irritation, I was not worried. Between the two of us, and no doubt Jasper also, we would figure it out. We always did. As the dream world ended and my awareness increased, living in a stranger's body flashed through my mind. Surely those events had been nothing more than an extremely vivid dream. Because in the real world, the body you were born with was the body you died in. People didn't magically wake up in someone else's skin. This wasn't some novel where I was the protagonist or worse, the supporting character. This was my life. It might have thus far been a boring one, but it was mine. My fear that somehow, against reason, the impossible had actually happened crippled me. Unable to move, I wished myself back to sleep, which unfortunately wasn't working. Without my conscious desire, my senses had begun to take in information, telling me the same message. This awakening was reminiscent of the impossible, rather than my room in Charlie's or even Renee's. The fear mingled with disappointment, creating an intense, overwhelming apprehension. Between my mind becoming clearer the longer I was awake and my feelings, tears started to stream down my cheeks, water landing in my ears. Sad and heavy, not wanting to get out of bed, my mind reviewed all the events in what was sinking in to have been yesterday, as if the action would result in a solution being found. Jamerica's dad had picked me up after school, looking irritated. Instead of being mad at me like I thought he would, given the look on his face, he simply sighed heavily. It's not like you to be sick, he informed me after a few minutes had passed. Everything okay? Fine, I informed him, completely unwilling to share. He raised his eyebrow at me and studied me closely, like I was some kind of experiment gone wrong. I've got to go back to work, he told me formally once he stopped his examination. Tons of paperwork due to the accident. Told Mom already that it'll be late. Please don't give her any lip today. Sure, I agreed, knowing at the bare minimum that I didn't want to find out what their form of punishment might be. Rennie had always been stanchly against any kind of punishment, believing that it undermined children's creativity. And Charlie barely raised his voice unless I was in danger, while often gave a stern lecture when I displeased him, but I was old enough to know that not every family was like that. Most kids in Phoenix got grounded, but it didn't take much to figure out that some parents still believed in corporal punishment.
That was definitely something I never wanted to experience.
It had taken me a few minutes of rummaging to figure out where in her backpack Jamerica kept her keys. Eventually finding them, I got out of the squad car and moved towards their front door. Once the door was open, I turned and waved at her dad, assuming that was something she would have done. He smiled grimly and then backed out of the drive. Maybe I had guessed wrong. Finding my way back into the room I had woken up in, I had opened my books and started the homework, simply to have something occupy my mind. It honestly wasn't that hard, except many of the math parts I couldn't remember, for which I had to refer to the textbook, and Quileute was a complete mystery. The hardest part was staying focused, as my brain was in rebellion to events. "Where are you, baby girl?" I heard a woman's voice ask right after the front door had been opened. Looking up at the clock, 2 hours had passed. "Upstairs," I answered, assuming she was asking about me. No one appeared for a while, although the sounds of other kids playing made it harder to concentrate than before, so I assumed she was making food or something. I was on the Quileute homework, which I had saved for last, when my door opened. "You hungry?" the same female voice asked. Turning round, I found myself faced with a beautiful woman that reminded me a little of the blacks. Maybe Jamerica's mom had some Quileute heritage in her. It certainly was common enough. It explained why my skin was so much lighter than Mr. White's. Yet it was darker than Mrs. White's. Mine was somewhere in between. The skin tone of Mrs. White reminded me of how Rennie liked her tea with milk along with a slight reddish hue. It was strange but beautiful to see how these two people had created Jamerica. Yes, please, I told her in my most respectful voice. Homework, she asked gruffly, like she was bone tired. Finishing up Quileute, I let her know. Find a place to stop and come downstairs. Martin needs help with his homework. Dinner is almost ready. Your dad is working late, she told me sternly. Yes, Mum, I replied, feeling trepidation in the face of her tone. All right then, she stated after a pause. Don't take long. Will do, I promised. She turned and left, leaving my door open. Maybe they didn't close doors in this house. Feeling overwhelmed and uncertain, I couldn't concentrate anymore. After trying for a few more minutes, I gave up, marked my place, and made my way downstairs following the noise. Martin, come do your homework, she instructed him, as soon as I found the space the three of them were in. The youngest one was on the floor playing with cars and trucks and seemed content enough. At least her words had informed me of which little brother was Martin.
Finding a seat at their dining table, I waited a few minutes, pleased at the job she had assigned me, as I had tutored a little in Phoenix.
As soon as the second boy returned with some pieces of paper and sat down next to me, I asked him, so, what are you working on? Math, he huffed. Let's see what we can do, I encouraged him.
It took a little to figure out that he liked to add numbers when it was a subtraction and subtract when it was an addition, along with struggling to carry the digits into the tens column when it was more than 9, but by the time his mom instructed us to clear the table he had it almost done.
After Mrs. White served the two boys, Martin had requested to sit next to me, and then handing me a plate, I started eating. Are you forgetting something, Jamerica, her mother asked me. Looking up at her dumbfounded, I had no idea what to say. Maybe they didn't start eating until everyone was served. I waited. Once Mrs. White sat down with her plate, I checked before taking a bite again. Then, I noticed that Martin held his little hand out to me, as did Jamerica's other brother. Not sure what else to do, I took their hands. Then everyone bowed their heads. Great Spirit, thank you for keeping us safe through this day, Mrs. White began. Heal those in the car accident this morning. Bring my husband home safely. And bless this food for nourishment of our bodies. Amen. Amen, I repeated softly, slightly uncomfortable, but not wanting to be disrespectful. Despite the turmoil of the day and my promise to myself not to think about Edward, I couldn't help but imagine his family doing something similar. I could never be sure, but they seemed like the kind of family where giving thanks for a meal and spending time around a table like it was important to them. Honestly, it was kind of nice, if not a little old-fashioned. Rennie was too unpredictable and busy for us to eat together regularly, and Charlie worked too much for it to be something I could count on. Once everyone else started eating, I picked up my fork and ventured a taste. It was some kind of rice and vegetable dish that was completely new to me, but I liked it. She hand-served me very much, so upon finishing I was still slightly hungry. I wasn't sure if there was more food though, and didn't want to ask. Mrs. White must have been paying close attention to me, because shortly after my decision to stay quiet she caught my attention and then asked, "You still hungry?" A little, I admitted, embarrassed. I set aside some for your father, but there's enough for you to have a bit more, she informed me, standing up and putting out her hand. Despite my uncertainty of what she was expecting, I made a guess, taking my plate from the table and handing it to her. It seemed to be the right thing, as she took it from me and went into the kitchen, returning a few minutes later with a small helping. I know things have been difficult since your grandmama's passing, but your dad and I are almost out from under all that. Things will get better, Jamerica, she told me in a tone that I assumed she meant to be assuring. Nodding that I had heard her, I didn't know what to say. It's not like I could explain to her that I wasn't really her daughter. I know you and Mandy have been friends since you started school, but not everyone you meet in the big bad world is meant to stay in our lives. Family, on the other hand, you're stuck with.
I'm glad to see your attitude change for the better today, but that doesn't mean I want you to become someone else, she told me with a touch of sadness. Looking up at her, she stared at me as if she could see straight through me.
Just be you, Jamerica. You have a good heart and a strong mind. You're a good friend and grandmama loved every bit of you. Even though she wasn't talking about me, I couldn't stop the tears from flowing. No one had ever said such a thing to me.
Would she utter such beautiful assuring words if she knew the truth? Probably not, but for a moment I wanted to pretend as if she was speaking to me.
She looked at me puzzled and then out of the blue asked, "You cramping?" Appalled, I didn't know what to say to such a blunt question. No, Mum, finally stumbled out of my mouth when her eyes boring into me got to be too much. She looked at me questioningly but said nothing. When I finished what she had served, she instructed, "Go ahead and clear the table and clean the kitchen." Yes, Mum, I replied, way more formal than I usually spoke, but realizing that it was the response that caused her to appear the least suspicious of me. Doing as she had requested, she took the two boys upstairs. It wasn't long after that I heard a bath being run. Then, when I was nearly done with the kitchen, the sounds indicated that she was putting them to bed. After finishing the chore, I went back to my room to complete my homework. I was as close to being as done as possible, which was to say almost nothing, since it was complete gibberish to me, when I heard the front door open. Mrs. White's lack of concern and the deep voice that greeted her caused me to assume the newest arrival had been Mr. White. Ironically, I could hear him undoing his uniform in almost the same way Charlie did when he came in after work. It was a comforting sound and brought a tear to my eye.
As I had left the bedroom door open, since that seemed to be preferred here, I could hear bits of their conversation wafting up to me.
She's not herself, Ken, Mrs. White insisted. Then some time later she added, it's like she got body snatched. I'm telling you there's something wrong with the girl. I told her to be respectful to you. That's all, Mr. White disagreed, but his tone was also concerned, as if he was trying to assure them both. There was talk about the next day and transportation for everyone, but I heard nothing more about myself. The words keep tumbling over and over again in my mind. Would have Randy picked up on such small changes possibly, but then it wasn't difficult to imagine her forming some ridiculous conclusions and being happy that I was transformed into someone who was less like Charlie. It was highly doubtful that Charlie would notice that I wasn't myself. He barely knew me and was gone most of the time. Saddened by these thoughts and how much I had wished for parents like these, I cried myself to sleep. Returning to the present from my memory of last night, my eyes were trained on the ceiling. Remembering the feelings from the night before combined with my disappointment of not being myself resulted in a weight of heaviness bearing heavy upon the center of my chest. Tears collected, as if ready to fall, but the sense of helplessness regarding my situation blocked them from leaving the corners of my eyes. Wishing my life back wasn't working. Soon someone would be at the door to ensure I went to school. Knowing my time was limited, I tried to sort myself out, to prepare myself for what the day might hold. Mrs. White's tone had been harsh, but her words genuine, and the idea of being truly seen and heard were so enticing. Yet, I was not their kin and desiring to be so wouldn't make it true. Sadness and despondency coated my entire being, resulting in my mind attempting to convince my body to go back to sleep. It didn't work, instead resulting in a greater intensity of the heavy feelings. Exactly as I had expected, a heavy knock resounded through the room, and then a warning came through the door, your butt better not be still in the bed. The combination ensured that I was awake. Despite my envy of Jamerica's parents' attentiveness of her, it wasn't hard to deduct that they were my greatest danger in being revealed. The awkwardness and uneasiness of living in someone else's place certainly wasn't in my favor. Unfortunately, I was completely clueless on how to get my life back. If I didn't want to generate an argument with her parents, I needed to get out of bed and be diligent with each moment as it came. Getting up, I started to get ready. Then, I got stuck on the hair. With no better ideas, I pulled it into a ponytail and showered that way. It seemed to work, although it took me some time to figure out what body wash to use. After finally cutting the water off, I then was faced with the problem of not knowing which towel was Jamerica's. It was only after stepping out of the tub that I considered that my shower might have gone on for too long given Mrs. White's speech about things getting better.
Grabbing a towel, hoping it was fine to borrow, I re-entered Jamerica's room and tried to find some garments to wear to school, especially in light of Mandy's critiques.
Clearly my choices yesterday weren't Jamerica's usual flair. It took some time, but eventually I found an outfit that might allow me to blend in better, while also being comfortable and covering this body up. When I came downstairs, Mrs. White directed me to help the boys get packed up. With a tight voice she told me right before leaving, breakfast is in the kitchen. Thank you, I told her sincerely. I couldn't remember the last time someone had made me breakfast. At the table I found Mr. White. Your mom and I are worried about you, he told me, putting down the newspaper. Yeah, I asked, afraid that if I said anything else, he would see through a lie. We love and care about you. Of course we're worried, he stated unequivocally. I didn't mean to worry you, I told him, hoping this truth would assure him and end the conversation. It's a parent's job to worry, he shared with me, a light chuckle escaping his lips. Your mom and I both know that you're going through a lot with losing grandmama and then this mess with Mandy. After I voiced a non-committal sound, he continued, but you don't need to change who you are for anybody. Be proud of how God has made you. Don't flaunt it, but don't try to shape yourself into something else either, he instructed. Okay, I told him, unsure of how else to respond to what he had said. His countenance got more serious. Baby girl, you know how much I love your mother and together we made our family, but I would never have done so at the expense of my parents and relatives. The same is true for your mother.
You are not just you are a representative in the world of your mother and I, you also carry within you the blood of the Cullens, Hos, and the African slaves from which my family is descended. My mother might have passed from this earth, and she might be the last of my bloodkin that lived in the area, but, my daughter, her leaving doesn't mean you can cut out that part of you.
Looking at my food and my appetite diminished, I answered, "Yes, sir," unsure what else to say, especially in light of the reality that the deed was already done. "Your mother thinks this is all about a boy," he uttered, as if that idea was silly. "No man, no friend, no future is worth having if it requests that you discard your heritage. You will never outrun who you are." "Family first," I stated, hoping that would let him know I was listening. The fact that I was sitting here and not Jamerica made it apparent that she had already gone against all of what he was saying. She probably had her own reasons that had nothing to do with her parents, but in light of his speech her choices caused me to feel sad. I worked at keeping my feelings to myself. He frowned. "I know the way our family functions is different from many of your school friends. If that means you lose them, let them go. You have Leah as well as other cousins. You are not alone in this world, no matter how Mandy treats you or wants you to become like them." "Yes, sir," I replied, taken aback by the forcefulness of his words. He got up and told me, "Bus is leaving in 2 minutes." I wasn't hungry anymore, but nevertheless tried to eat everything on my plate, well aware of what it meant to waste food from times with Rennie. He and I said nothing to each other as he drove me to school. It seemed like he had said his piece and allowed the silence. It was another way that he reminded me of Charlie. My morning classes were better academically. It hadn't been that hard to remember the material, especially after completing the homework last night. Consequently, most of my thoughts were regarding the speech Mr. White had given me. It kept repeating itself in my head. The love he spoke about wasn't something I had experienced in my family, and it wasn't a romantic one like from my favorite novels. It was something else that had to do with trust and self-awareness and leaning into each other. It was beautiful in its way, and actually seemed steadier than the love featured in the books I read so often. Despite its radical notion for me, I even considered that Romeo and Juliet's love paled in comparison. The love he described might not make for a drama or tragedy, but it seemed ardent from what I had observed thus far. Why would Jamerica have been willing to give that up, assuming her parents' concerns were valid?
Other than exchanging niceties and answering teachers' questions, I spoke to no one the whole morning, as I had been lost in my thoughts.
In the cafeteria I sat near the sophomores once more, ensuring to keep my distance from Mandy and her band of followers. Initially I was hesitant to search the cafeteria.
However, my desire to understand what was happening to me, especially as I was on day 2 in Jamerica's body, was stronger than my fear or reluctance.
This time I found myself. It was weird to observe me from an outside perspective. It was clear that my body's presentation was different.
The clothes were more revealing, there was makeup, my hair was done up, and it seemed like something romantic was going on with Mike.
What kind of person would steal a body for a guy? A kind of fury that I had never before experienced sizzled under the skin I inhabited. Yet, the idea of turning the emotion into some kind of action caused me to wilt.
Unwilling to confront myself, as that seemed super weird, but repulsed at watching my body behave bizarrely, I got up and left to go to my next class, even if it meant that I would be early to gym.
Taking advantage of Jamerica's ability to be less challenged with coordination, I moved at a brisk pace. Opening the cafeteria door, I turned back and looked at the Cullen table. At that exact moment Edward locked eyes with me and I remembered our conversation in biology. Immediately my mind flashed with Mr. White's words about the importance of family. I smiled tightly in his direction and turned, leaving. I took my time putting on the ugly gym clothes, allowing others to join me before exiting the changing room.
Excited about the possibility of not being a danger to the other students, for the first time ever, I was looking forward to the coach instructions.
When the whistle blew, I played hard. I wasn't the best by any means, but the reality that I hadn't injured anyone was a joyous thing to behold. This small joy wasn't worth the cost of living a stranger's life by any means, but it was a nice benefit in the midst of so much sadness and disappointment. My last class, Twilight, was impossible, as it was intermediate and I knew nothing of the language. The best part of being Jamerica was that everyone already knew her, so her classmates said hi and stuff, but without the attention I had upon my arrival. For the first time since coming to Forks I was blending in. The last bell rang, and I still didn't have Jamerica's locker information, so went outside. After a few minutes it became clear to me that no one was picking me up, so I set out to walk home.
Unfortunately, I got a little lost, so by the time my feet passed the threshold, I didn't have much time to work on my homework before Mrs.
White got home with the boys. This time, I stopped immediately and went down to help. By the time dinner was served, Martin's homework was complete and we had even played a little together. After praying over the food, Mrs. White looked critically at me. "What do you want?" Uncertain of what she meant, I nevertheless took the opportunity to ask her for something I needed in the off chance that this wasn't a 48-hour thing. I want to change my hair. She scowled and told me, we don't have any money for the weaves you've been asking for, you know that. Something else, I asked, having no idea what weaves were and hoping she would suggest something. You willing to have me style it, she questioned. Sure, I agreed easily, as her doing it possibly meant she'd teach me something. She looked at me critically. Probably sure wasn't a Jamerica answer. I'll make some time Saturday. Maybe some braids, she asked. And then I'll do an oil treatment. Thanks, Mom, I answered, even though the word felt wrong on my tongue. She nodded. Then after a moment asked, homework done? I still have quite a bit left, I admitted. All right, clear the table but leave the dishes and finish up your homework, she dictated. Yes, Mom, I stated. When I went to stand, she eyed me like I was forgetting something fundamental.
Going through my memories of being at other people's houses, I guessed at asking, may I be excused, as it was something a friend of mine in Phoenix parents required.
That was what she expected, as she relaxed and agreed. After clearing the table, I went to my room and finished up the homework, except for Quilliute. By the time I went to brush my teeth and get ready for bed, Mr. White was home and the boys were in bed. Going downstairs, I wished them good night, as it seemed the polite thing to do. Mr. White followed me up. Want the window open, he asked, surprising me. No thanks, I told him, wanting to stay as warm as possible. He nodded but stayed in the doorway. Eventually he asked, did you hear me today, Jamerica?
I heard you, Dad, I answered, the name as foreign as Mom had been, family first, friends and guys second.
Okay then, he stated, and then turned off the light. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams, I repeated back. Closing my eyes, I reviewed my day. A heavy rock settled in the pit of my stomach as realization came to me that I had enjoyed the day as Jamerica more than any of the ones in my own skin since arriving in Forks. Even though I could have never known it, this family unit filled a hole that had existed within me. I felt bad for my thoughts as they related to my parents, but then again it wasn't as if they didn't have a daughter. They just didn't have me. Mrs. White's awareness that I wasn't acting like Jamerica sat heavy with me and allowed me to see how alone I had felt all these years straddled between my parents. They were good people. It was that Granny was focused on herself and Charlie hadn't gotten a chance to know me with, as I had spent little time with him. A part of me yearned to know what it might be like to get to know him. The evidence from yesterday and especially today in the cafeteria suggested Jamerica was a body snatcher. I was livid in an intensity that was new to me. She had harmed me in so many ways, yet there were ways to penalize her. It's not like I could go tell the authorities or even her parents, let alone Charlie. After hours of comparing my life as a swan and now as a white, what it meant in my present as well as my future, I decided, despite the weirdness and challenges, if my conclusions were correct, that I would appreciate a few more days in her family. She might not have, but I would take involved parents who saw me truly with siblings over my place in my family, even though it contained far more independence than this family. Being accepted was a wondrous thing. Yet, as my mind fell asleep, I realized that acceptance wasn't possible, since I was an imposter. Only Jamerica had that. It was out of my grasp and could never be mine. Sleep finally took me as tears streamed from my eyes. In my groggy, not quite awake state, the quietness disconcerted me. I opened my mouth to yell for my dad, but something stopped me. Taking the covers over my head in order to protect myself from whatever was out there, the sheets were all wrong. Then, like one of my brothers had run into me at full throttle, I was overpowered with a sense of déjà vu.
It shook me so hard that instead of jumping into action, as I would have normally done, I was frozen in place, so tried to figure out what might be happening.
Opening my eyes, I suspiciously evaluated the purple comforter. Why was it purple? Was I sleeping over at a friend's house and forgotten due to my disgust of the color and not wanting to look at it anymore? I pushed it off me. To my jubilation, my confusion cleared in the best way possible. I was still Bella Swan. Yesterday had been the most perfect day, and I could only imagine it getting better. Gone were the first day jitters. I had learned Mike's friends' names. I had even hung out with them and fooled them into believing I was Bella. I could only get better at this. Despite my exhilaration, my body was still frozen in place. I replayed my memory of yesterday multiple times, examining it from every angle. Had Mike really kissed me? It seemed like a dream come true. All my Christmas and birthday wishes had come at once, and I had lived a day that I hadn't even dared wish for, even while creating and carrying out the spell. Like lightning, my body jumped into motion. Not only was I still in Bella Swan's body, the alarm I had set had yet to go off, giving me even more time to get ready. Exuberant to see what the day would hold, I was going to take advantage of the opportunity to improve my presentation. A kiss was a great first step, but this was about true love and living happily ever after. Regardless of how into me he had seemed yesterday, and how I knew him not to be a fickle person, I wanted to make a second impression that would tie us even closer together. First, I made sure to go the extra mile with my body care, including shaving. Her skin didn't seem to need the level of moisturizing that mine did. Her hair texture and its needs were also completely different to what I was used to. Fortunately, the feminine hair products in the shower were reminiscent of Mandy's. The labels stated that they were shampoo and conditioner. The conditioner I used went in after the shower. Nevertheless, I followed the instructions on the bottle. They seemed to do the trick.
With the slight curl in her hair, I had searched for some type of straightener product but had found none.
She was definitely an all-natural girl.
I figured if I changed it slowly, then it would seem like she'd gotten into it, which no one should question, not even her father.
The second day of rummaging through her drawers and closet resulted in frustration, reminding me of yesterday morning. The reminder that I was on day 2 had a pleasant aspect to it, but her clothes had made me want to scream. She really liked baggy, shapeless items. On top of that, she had very few items to begin with. It was like her parents had forgotten to clothe her. I just didn't get it. What girl didn't have a decent selection of options? My parents were struggling. They had mentioned things being tight after my grandmama died, but they still had managed to buy me more clothes than her. And her clothes were in top brands. I mean, if she was a label girl, then few items might have made sense. But she wasn't. It was like she simply didn't have what she needed. It occurred to me that maybe it wasn't about money. Maybe Chief Swan was neglectful or something.
Not wanting to get down when it was the start to second day, I put on a second-rate outfit, even though it was the best out of the bad options, and focused on getting ready.
Applying the little makeup she had was a little easier, since I didn't have to take it off and start again as many times. By the time I was walking out the door, I would be right on time, which was disappointing, since I had been hoping to be a little early in order to see Mike before the first bell. Driving to school once more caused my thoughts to veer towards my dad. Truth be told, I missed him. My mom and I never seemed to see eye to eye, but my dad was something special. In comparison, other than a voice through the door, I hadn't had any interactions with Chief Swan. Where my father was warm and supportive, Chief Swan seemed awkward and cold. The strangest part was that he treated me almost like we were roommates rather than being his kid. It wasn't bad, per se, and served me, certainly, but it was odd, and caused me to miss my father even more. The rumors were that Bella's mom had run off with her when she was little, and Chief Swan had stayed to take care of his parents. I imagined that they had shared custody of Bella like other divorced families in my class, but Washington to Arizona had to have made it extra challenging. Maybe Chief Swan had never had to be a father in a live with her kind of way before. To grow up without a dad caused me to feel a little bad for her. It must have sucked. Hopefully her not having a dad growing up wouldn't cause mine to grow too suspicious. Worried about all the things that could go wrong and how Bella could out me began to fester. Telling myself that I could just deny it straight out and make her look crazy calmed me. Maybe I could find a way to get Leah to threaten her into silence or arrange it for us to talk, so I could threaten her into staying silent. If she knew what was good for her, she would hide what was happening and lay low. Just in case, though, I needed to get some dirt on her. My plan decreased my worries and I once more focused on driving. It was only my third time behind the wheel alone after all. The first bell rang right as I finished parking, so there was no time to see Mike or his friends. The first day Bella started at Forks High, it was obvious how much attention Mike was giving her. He was like a one-man welcome band. Immediately, I had started following her at a discreet distance, of course. In this way, I had learned her schedule and the location of her locker. It was a blessing that Bella had been so unobservant of her surroundings. She had always been watching where she was walking rather than around her. Despite all that, I had learned her locker combination, so would have to endure Mrs. Cope to procure it. Just like the homework that I had tried to understand last night, the material in class was more advanced than I was accustomed.
The first class was English, which wasn't so bad, since writing was writing and books were books.
Eric was in the class, which I saw as an advantage. I hoped that since he had been with us and Mike had acted like they were friends, had be willing to help me out. On top of passing classes, being in with Mike's friends seemed smart.
So, I made sure to be kind and friendly with him, but not too much, so as to not give him any false hope in getting with me.
After English, I walked in the direction of Mike's class. In a good and bad way, Mike was almost as unobservant as Bella. Although in the past I had wished he had noticed me in Bella's body, it made it kind of perfect. Thus, it wasn't difficult to make it seem like me running into him was happenstance. "Hey Bella," he offered me with a wide smile as soon as our eyes connected. "Hey Mike," I answered, and to my mortification felt my cheeks warming. Bella could often be found blushing, but I had thought it had to do with her inability to hide her emotions. Instead, it seemed to be a physical response. Ugh. Working at being coy, as that had been something Mike liked, I hid behind her hair, like I had seen her do. As my observations had indicated, they had this class together, which seemed like an extra score. Sitting down next to him, I then parted my hair slightly and looked at him through my eyelashes. He smiled and blushed a little, so I assumed that playing coy had worked for him. Oddly though, he seemed nervous throughout the rest of class. His state caused my mind to swirl. Had I done something to put him off me? Had my plan backfired already? What was he thinking? Had I already lost my chance with him? For each question, I created a possible way to win him back. After going through so much, I had thought the rest would be easy. But then again, when had my life ever been easy? Grandmama had helped me from beyond to create the swap. She would help me again. I was sure of it.
Right before she had died, she had held my hand and told me that life was short, to enjoy it, to hold tightly to happiness and love, and to remember to think before I leaped.
As the days after her funeral had passed, I had longed to do her proud and live up to her words. It was like the second day after the funeral and I had been out of it when I had bumped into someone.
When my eyes had met Mike's, he apologized, and then had asked how I was holding up, going on to say how sad he had been when his grandfather had died.
In the days afterwards, his kind words and thoughtfulness had stood out in contrast to nearly everyone else, who had acted like I carried a disease. My confidence that we were destined to be together decreased my worries. When the bell rang indicating the class had ended, Mike waited for me and then walked me out. Relieved that he was still showing interest, I thanked Grandmama and then made sure to flirt and act coy some more. Want to do something Friday night? Mike asked about halfway to my next class. Inwardly jumping for joy at his words, I remained cool, turned towards him, and smiled. Yeah, Daho really liked it. All nervousness that had occupied his face disappeared. Instead, he looked pleased, a smile widely occupying his face. Then he told me, excellent. I can't wait. Maybe you'll even get another kiss. Relief swept through me. Rather than his state being a result of him wanting to separate himself from me, it seemed likely that he had been nervous to ask me out.
Clearly, I still had a lot to learn about Mike, but that was fine. I corrected myself before my thoughts could get too upset, as long as we were heading in the right direction.
Remembering Lee's recommendation to show interest, but not too much, I smiled at him and certainly, telling him, guess that depends. On what? He challenged. On how good the date is, I retorted with a teasing smile. I see how you are, he rejoined teasingly, while his posture had changed like he was taking on a challenge. Lee's advice had seemed to be working thus far. She had been engaged after all, so it wasn't too surprising. He walked with me a bit more before it was clear that he planned on walking me all the way to class.
A part of me didn't want him to get into trouble, but another part, the part that won out, said that him being late was a sign of how much I meant to him. When we got to my class, I told him, thanks Mike, and then kissed him on the cheek before turning around and entering class.
Each class material seemed to get worse and worse, and my understanding less and less. Trying to be a junior was definitely going to be a problem. I wasn't the greatest student anyway, but adding the advanced material just caused me to feel like an idiot.
At least my actions with Mike seemed to be the right ones, as he met me in the hall between each class and walked me to the next one.
Excited and pleased at my ability to keep him interested, I began reviewing what had worked and how to ensure we moved towards being an official couple. Every day after Mike had shared about his grandfather's death, I had thought more and more about him.
As I did, the more memories came to me about him, all the times in my life when he had gone out of his way to speak to me, along with how sweet he has always been to me.
It took me a while to puzzle out what all those years of short interactions all meant, but eventually my conclusion was that he and I were destined to be together. It seemed so obvious once I realized it. I had felt a little dumb for not knowing sooner. And me bumping into Mike only 2 days after the funeral was my grandmama's way of helping point me towards my future happiness. Even though she had made my future clear, him and I were like star-crossed lovers. The barriers of high school life and small-town stupidness prevented us from loving each other.
Usually it was the guy's job to make the first move, but with my grandmama's wisdom repeating in my mind, after our moment sharing in the grief of a beloved grandparent, I had finally gotten enough courage to approach him.
When we were within a few feet of each other, I had said hi. He had looked in my direction briefly, smiled warmly at me, while his eyes apologized, and then he had focused back on his friend. His lack of courage to break through the great barriers and say hi back was discouraging, for sure, but his smile told me everything I needed to know. Clearly he was felt as pulled to me and I did him. That moment was like the puzzle glue that tied everything together, confirming that making our destiny happen was in my hands. The night I had my big blowout with Mandy, I was stumped about how to bring us together. After lots of thought, the only idea that came to mind was to discreetly follow him. I learned his schedule and then one day made my move to talk with him. When we bumped into each other, he apologized and helped me get my books. He even smiled at me. It was the same smile as before, so it had confirmation that he was indeed interested in me. Then, before we could say anything else to one another, his friend called his name and he ran off. It was such a typical guy thing to do, reminding me of boys' treatment of girls they liked when we were in the second grade.
The interaction reinforced my belief that despite how much he liked me, he was scared to traverse the firm lines of Fork's hierarchy.
The spell had erased all barriers, making it possible for him to be strutting and showing off to the other boys that I had chosen him. I sent a prayer of thanks to God and Grandmama for making it possible. At lunch, Mike sat next to me, putting his arm on the back of my chair. It was a classical boy territorial ploy, but I didn't mind. Rather, I enjoyed it, reveling in what it might mean. Every once in a while, I caught Mandy's gaze across the cafeteria. I would smile at her in a gleeful, proud way. Once when I caught her staring fuming, I leaned into Mike's chest and said something small about a teacher to him. He laughed. It had the desired effect. You could practically see the steam rising from Mandy's head. Hopefully, our interaction would make it painfully clear to her that Mike and I were meant to be, and she needed to let her delusion of being his go. For the rest of lunch she scowled and her lips puckered, like she had just sucked on a lemon. Her look increased my smile. What really mattered was that the swap worked, confirming that Mike and I were destined. Nonetheless, Mandy being upset was a delightful icing on the cake. It was the best revenge I could have imagined for how she treated me. After lunch I had the unfortunate experience of learning that biology has assigned seating. Not only was I not next to Mike, but my lab partner was Edward Cullen. Before the swap I had been hard-pressed to believe that Quaalude magic was real. And if magic was real, then so were the stories about Cold Ones, Protectors and the Cullens. My brain felt like it might explode. If the spell did anything, it had made me a believer of the Quaalude histories. For the first time, I was truly proud of my heritage and hoped that my grandmama would be looking down pleased at how I had taken her words to heart. Thinking about her always brought me down, even if it was about the good moments with her. Not wanting to be sad when things were going my way, nor did I want to even think something that would dishonor her, I instead focused on my blessings. First, the spell had actually worked. The Quaalude oral history meant he was inhuman. The Cullens weren't meant to be dangerous to humans, assuming they kept their word, but Daho never been near to one before. Seeing him up close confirmed for me the legends. He tried to talk to me, but I wasn't having it. The possibility and his nearness kept me on edge, getting in the way of concentrating on the material, which went way over my head. He spent the rest of the time Mr. Banner taught after I shut him down, gazing out the window, and I ignored him. Unfortunately, there was group work, and it just escalated everything.
It was an hour of nerve-wreaking, fear-induced torture, where my mind kept imagining how quickly he could kill me, and when not focused on that, considering how failing biology would ruin everything for me.
The I shall suck your blood thing really was a turn-off and made me want to run as fast as possible. Surviving biology without failing or giving myself away would be hard enough, doing so with a Cullen was asking for the impossible. Leaving biology was a godsend. The last period was even better since Mike was in gym with me. He volunteered to be on my team and didn't complain about this body's lack of coordination. After changing, Mike waited for me. So, at the last bell, Mike and I walked out of gym class together. I need to visit Mrs. Cope, I let him know. Sure, he answered, while continuing to walk with me. Smiling at the action, I thanked him and then asked him if he understood what had been taught in biology. Unfortunately, he didn't seem to really get the class either, although he made some under-breath remark about Edward that I ignored.
When we entered the office, Mike stood at the back wall, and I stepped towards the counter, bracing myself for Mrs.
Cope's hostile attitude. When she took note of me, she smiled at me kindly with a sweet warmth like she cared about me and asked, "What can I do for you, Bella?" I lost my locker combination, I sputtered out, expecting a stern tongue lashing.
"It happens to us all," she assured me with a smile and an understanding tone, "and you just started."
Hold on 1 minute while I get that for you. My mouth opened up a little and bees could have made a hive in my mouth, as my brain was unable to process her treatment of me. Sure, I had noticed a few times how Mandy would get treated with more respect and courteousness than myself when we were in Port Angeles, but this was Forks. Everyone knew my mom and dad. They were well-respected members of the community. He was a police officer and her a nurse, for goodness sake. Was it because Bella was the chief's daughter and everyone wanted to stay on his good side, or was Mrs. Cope's attitude something to do with me? I didn't get it. Her change of attitude bothered me more than I would want to admit, although I thanked her when she gave me the combination. Mike walked me to my truck and then made some comment. "I'm so sorry, Mike," I told him. "I've seen Mrs. Cope be rude to other students, yet she was so nice to me. I just don't get it and am a little upset by it. I apologize." He sighed. No need to apologize. She is picky about who she treats well or not. The Cullens get the royal treatment and she treats me well but not Eric. I get it. It sucks to see the differences. Exactly. I agreed and hugged him tightly. Thank you for understanding. No problem, he stated with a small smile, helping me into the truck. Wish I could come to yours and study, but I have to work at the shop. Yeah, that sucks, I stated.
Then putting my hand on his arm, even though I wore gloves and he a jacket, I gazed into his eyes and attempted to sound sultry as I stated, maybe another time.
His irises grew and he stuttered a little, sure, Bella. Holding in my happy dance for how Mike responded, I was proud of myself for making my grandmama pleased. She would no doubt look down upon me and see how hard I was working at thinking before acting. Heading back to Chief Swan's, I thought about a conversation with my dad the first time Mrs. Cope had been rude to me. He had told me that her treatment of me was probably due to her ignorant judgmental views. Immediately, I had dismissed his statement, as it had seemed ridiculous at the time. I grew angry, realizing my foolishness for not believing him. Yet, due to the body swap, I wasn't the one Mrs. Cope treated badly. Knowing there was nothing I could do about it and not wanting to dwell on such depressing thoughts, I focused on how the day went with Mike. I was pleased with how I had maintained Mike's attention for the day and covered over my lack of attention at the end. He hadn't even glanced at Jessica. And we seemed to have bonded over Mrs. Cope's treatment of students. It was beyond exciting to see how things were progressing in the right direction. As an added bonus, I had managed through the whole day without anyone doubting I was Bella. Biology had been terrible and I'll have to be extra careful there, but overall the classes had gone okay. The only real concern at this point was not failing them. The Quaalude stories rattled in my brain. The part where Drive Cullen had promised in the treaty that no Cullen would harm a human circled round and round. There had been no mysterious deaths over the last 2 years since their arrival. Although that might keep me from Edward's jaws, it still didn't solve the problem of being his lab partner. I really wanted nothing to do with him. He and all the other Cullens creeped me the fuck out.
As soon as I got to Chief Swan's, I searched Bella's closet, but there wasn't anything close to being suitable for a date, so I went downstairs, wrote the chief a note saying that I had gone to Port Angeles to get a few shirts, and took the cash in the jar that was in the kitchen, even though it said food on it.
I was a little scared in doing so, as I didn't know the kind of consequences Chief Swan would give me for spending the food money. However, as I weighed up the options, it seemed to me like the date going well was worth any consequence. Clothes were critical for a date, and certainly much more important than studying for classes I didn't understand. Hopefully, Chief Swan would be sympathetic towards my logic when I explained in person. Once in Port Angeles, I went to a few shops that often had deals since I didn't have that much money. I was greeted with smiles and trite welcomes. No security guards followed me. A few employees even asked me if they could help me find something. It was like nothing I had ever experienced before. For the first time since shopping without my mother, I was able to relax and enjoy myself. Fortunately, I was able to find 3 tops and even better, one that would be ideal for a date. Thus, I drove back all smiles and pleased. I was even getting to be more comfortable driving.
Upon returning, Chief Swan still wasn't home, so I made a sandwich for myself, and then started on my homework.
At the sound of the front door closing, I went downstairs, wanting to face the music as soon as possible and get it over with. Dad, I greeted him, after his gun belt was hung up, even though using the title with Chief Swan was beyond weird. He looked startled, and a sweet smile crossed his face, like I had given him the world.
Taking that as a good sign, I continued, I went to Port Angeles today and used the money in the kitchen to get myself some new shirts.
His face scrunched up as if my words didn't make sense and then unexpectedly asked as if in disbelief, "You went shopping, why?"
Looking at the floor, sensing my cheeks warming, I answered, "Mike asked me out on a date, sir," and I said yes.
When I lifted my eyes, a little Chief Swan appeared stuck with his mouth open. After a few more minutes he asked, "And where is this date going?" Realizing that Mike hadn't given me any details, I confessed he hasn't told me the plans yet. Chief Swan huffed. Before I could lose my nerve, added, "And I really need new brass and underwear." I didn't get any this time, because I didn't have enough money, but Daho appreciated if I could get some of those items too. He looked at me like I was alien, but pulled out his wallet and handed me a couple of 20s. "That'll have to do." "Thank you," I told him, gushing and really meaning it. For extra measure, I went over and hugged him, adding, "You're the best."
Then, I ran back to my room, closing the door before he could change his mind or I could squeal in excitement.
His response answered so many questions. Clearly, it wasn't about the money. Bella wasn't being neglected or anything. Rather, bizarrely enough, it seemed to be of her own making. His responses implied that she didn't like shopping, which just seemed beyond strange, but whatever. The only problem it created was that I did care about clothes and I wasn't willing to hide it. This being an only child thing and the daughter of the chief was certainly a leg up. First off, I didn't get into trouble like I expected. Sure, he seemed surprised by my behavior, which Daho need to keep an eye out for, but I didn't get grounded or anything. Second, my parents had never handed me that much money for anything. Instead, they insisted on going with me and talked about the needs of the family and making sure everyone had what they needed. Not only were things with Mike heading in the right direction, but being Bella had come with all these other perks. It was fantastic. The only small hitch in being the chief's daughter was finding a reasonable explanation to convince him that Bella was becoming interested in clothes. Smiling ear to ear while heading to bed, I would absolutely solve this minor hiccup, as it was completely solvable in comparison to my family. Falling asleep, I thanked Grandmama for the swap, told her all about my blessings, and then prayed to the Great Spirit, Grandmama, and any other ancestor who might listen to have another day as Bella Swan. The day after Tyler's accident, there was still a lot of hype about it circling around the school verbally, and even worse in their thoughts. Despite them brushing up against death every day we were in their presence, they acted as if this incident was shattering their belief in their safety. Most of their thoughts displayed how they were simultaneously distraught and in disbelief. Humans' ability to deny the truth in front of them is what allowed us to move about them. In terms of instincts, it made them the stupidest species on the planet. Every other species hid or ran from us, from the smallest bug to those we hunted. Over and over again, the humans I had murdered had been the same. Their brains had refused to accept that they had become the prey. Even as they died, they attempted to find a way around the inevitable. One of the worst parts of high school minds was how it reminded me of those men, because both subgroups were certain in their invincibility. Over and over I had to remind myself that most of these infants would change and leave this stage of development behind, while the men I murdered were psychopathic. The similarities were more disturbing than I ever dared utter out loud, although given Jasper's thoughts on occasion he might agree. These children around us pretended we presented no danger, ignoring their biological signals that told them we were predators, while speaking about the accident as if they had nearly lost their life or limb. My irritation was high, particularly due to the females. Many women had been attracted to the men who I had killed. These women seemed to believe that being with the most dangerous man somehow made them safer. Unfortunately, due to their brush with harm, they were even more desirous of me than usual. "They must be really bugging you," Jasper said in the first period, even though we were in different classes. I attempted to calm my irritation, as to not bother him or make his situation worse. Him dealing with the conniving intent would be bad enough. Their stupidity made me wish that I hadn't promised my family. If it had been up to me, I would have tuned out every human in this building. Instead, I kept my gift open. Tyler was home, but not in school. My medical training suggested this was because Carlisle had warned against overstimulation. I couldn't imagine Tyler putting up any fuss about having to stay home, since academics weren't his passion. Other than Tyler's accident, the only notable thoughts were Mike's, as he seemed to be remembering kissing Bella. In addition to this memory, I observed her through Mike's eyes flirt with him and encourage him. It was odd to me, as previously Bella had been nothing over than giving Mike a polite dismissal since her arrival. My conclusion was that some event after the hospital was responsible. Her quick change of heart was typical of high schoolers, but I was nevertheless disappointed, which then confused me. As a result, Jasper kept sending me questions regarding his concern of my state throughout the morning. I reported these two notable items to my siblings as soon as we started our pretend eating of lunch, beginning with the thoughts within the building. Was our absence noticed at all? Jasper inquired after my explanation. There were no thoughts by students or teachers regarding our whereabouts, I informed them. There were a few more similar questions from either Jasper or Rosalie, ensuring that no suspicion was upon us. Each question required me to review the thoughts I had collected, helping me ensure that I had not missed anything. Our conclusion was that their heightened state brought no attention to us in any way, which was a relief. My near killing of Bella was enough. Even after reporting Bella's strange behavior, my siblings had disagreed with my insistence to keep an eye on her. She wasn't even in the parking lot for the accident, Emmett pointed out. You're grasping at straws, because her mental voice is silent to you. Could that be true? Jasper mused. I could not explain to them why, despite her not being impacted directly, I focused on Bella, but there was inconsistent behavior there. I planned on finding evidence to explain it. I hated a mystery as much as Alice. Bella's change of heart with Mike seemed completely unrelated to Alice's mystery. Yet, when looking at the day like a what is missing puzzle, it was the only item out of place. The worst part was my lack of capacity to explain my apprehension adequately to my siblings. Once that was settled, Jasper began asking questions about the fluctuating emotions he had gotten from me. I ignored him. Alice reported that she had made no progress figuring out the cause to her gift's fuzziness. My future was as difficult for her to tune into as it had been since its start. We talked about hypotheses for a bit. Then, right before the lunch period ended, a girl I had never met and didn't even know her name had stopped at the doorway of the cafeteria. I only glanced her way, because my gift had picked up an image of myself in her mind. Our eyes connected and the mental link between us strengthened. Additionally, there was a sense of two friends meeting after a separation, which was bizarre. To make things even stranger, the images flashing through her mind were memories of Bella and my one conversation in biology, as if she had been the one to have it with me. If that was not strange enough, her mind, after the memory, like a light switch had been thrown, focused on another memory, a conversation with an older man who through the resemblance was likely her father. Generally, human minds didn't work like that, and certainly not any high schooler that I had come across. They simply didn't have the mental discipline. Not to mention that usually, unless I purposely entered a human's mind, my gift collected all of their thoughts at once, dull and bland in comparison to a vampire's, but present. Instead, it was like I got one thought in high definition, almost like a vampire's mind, but singular. Before I could fully register the confounding elements happening, she broke eye contact, turned away, and left the cafeteria. It was a strain to keep focused on her mental voice, given the clamoring of my siblings and the other humans. Nevertheless, I was able to pick up most of her thoughts.
If what had happened already was not odd enough, there was no mental gushing about us Cullens, no thoughts about our beauty, actually no thoughts about us Cullens at all, except for the memory.
It was if we were the same as other students. Most humans almost could not help but be at least a little infatuated or repulsed by us. Either way, direct eye contact having no mental reaction was not something I had encountered in decades. The crescendo on this bizarre series of interactions was that this random girl's behavior reminded me a little of how Bella had reacted abnormally in our conversation after I had returned from Alaska. Were these mysteries related, it was certainly an avenue worth pursuing. Leave no stone unturned and all that. The accident and the family's concerns had pushed the details regarding the conversation in biology with Bella to the back of my mind. Was that only yesterday usually our lives were so monotonous that it was off-putting to realize how that hadn't been the case since Bella's arrival. Despite the accident, my task today was to evaluate Bella and the school to ensure my barely constraining the beast within hand endangered the family. With 2 days added, mysteries conversing with Bella in biology took on a new light. No longer was it merely a space to ensure our secrets stay hidden, but potentially an opportunity to unravel the strangeness. So little in our life was interesting, it was enjoyable to have a challenge. Hopefully my scrutiny of Bella would add clues, as she was the one person in the building behaving out of character, thereby getting clearer answers for my family. With what transpired with the strange girl increased my concern about Bella. I was especially irritated at not being able to come to a logical conclusion as to why the strange girl would have the memory of Bella and my encounter. Something was definitely afoot. "What is it?" Jasper asked, clearly picking up my emotions from the encounter. Shrugging my shoulders and sending him uncertainty, he replied, "After school." Affirming with him through his gift, nothing more was said. I wasn't yet ready to share with my family what had happened with the strange girl, especially since I had nothing to go on but a mystery and an unpleasant sensation within. In fact, I hoped to keep it to myself. Jasper must have picked up on my reluctance or resistance, because as the bell rang he warned me, "You're not off the hook. I expect an explanation at home." Internally I groaned, but did give him a slight nod. I would admit that since the encounter with the girl my thoughts and emotions were more tumultuous than usual, even including the side effects of keeping my gift open. Jasper had more than likely picked up that. All my hopes and expectations that biology with Bella would give me answers or at least some clarity was completely blown to smithereens. When she sat down I asked her how she was dealing with Tyler's accident. "Fine," she stated tersely, like my question was a bother. Given her reaction, especially as it was nearly opposite to how she had spoken to me yesterday, I was at a pondery of how to get her to open up. Then she proceeded to actively give me the cold shoulder, which added to the contrast. She didn't express any of the typical physical responses of fear in the least. So, that one part was the same as our last encounter, but everything else was different. Each minute that ticked by caused my suspicions to rise. First off, she was, at best, indifferent to me. In a way that part was assuring, since her seemingly previous curiosity that could have been worrisome for the family was absent. Yet the lack of curiosity, hiding, all while trying to catch glimpses of me, was lacking, adding even more odd aspects. Any minor concerns and puzzlement turned into something significant when we attempted to complete the worksheet. Building on our microscope activity, I insisted she go first. Rather than confident and irritated, she seemed lost. In fact, she spent the whole time reading the text, as if it was completely foreign to her, despite stating yesterday to Mr. Banner that she had taken the subject in Arizona. I could have passed it off as a technique to ignore me. However, whenever I brought her attention back to the sheet, she was so confused that it was as if none of the concepts were familiar to her. Where was the girl who had known the lab for onion root almost as well as me as a result of my refusal to do the work for her? We only answered 2 out of the 10 questions. Combined, my suspicions were confirmed that something was wrong about Bella. There were lots of additional little things, probably not noticeable to a human, but it was in the way she did not bite her pencil or cover her face with her hair or bite her lower lip.
She looked like Bella, and her blood definitely smelled intoxicating as always, but if I did not know any better, I'll say that she was possessed.
Mr.
Banner seemed pleased to be giving us a poor grade, me in particular, congratulating himself in his thoughts that he might have stumped me.
They were inconsequential thoughts from a small-minded, insecure little man. I would have not even noticed if it were not for the fact that I was monitoring the school's inhabitants for the family. Bella's reaction was most notable, as she did not seem to be that bothered, which was completely contrary to the high-achieving student she had previously presented herself to be. The small mercy her behavior offered was that I had barely needed to take a breath the entire period. By the time the bell rang indicating the end of biology, I was up and out of my seat as quickly as I could get away with. Ironically, whatever changes had happened to alter Bella, unless I was mistaking things, had increased the strength of the demon living inside of me. Her indifference of me seemed to weaken some element within me that had wanted to keep her alive. Never before could I have imagined that a girl's curiosity about me would be to my benefit. It was beyond ironic and something I hoped to hide from my family. Needless to say, I skipped the last class sitting in my car, attempting to contain the demon within who was working hard to convince me to lure her away from the school in order to enjoy the nectar and bliss that would occur by drinking her. Just like that first day I had come across Bella, my siblings found me beyond ready to leave. As soon as the Volvo was stationary in our garage, I was sprinting towards the closest animal. After it was drained, I found another. By the end of the third, I was almost once more in control of myself. I was reluctant to return home and face their mental voices, questions and opinions after keeping my gift open all day long. However, my sense of responsibility to the family overruled my selfish desires. Grudgingly, I took myself back to the family. Before arriving, I decided to shower, so that Alice could prepare everyone for the timing of our gathering. Clean and as ready to face them as possible, I headed downstairs.
Within seconds everyone had joined me and we had taken our usual spaces, with Carlisle at the end of the table to my left, Esme to his left, and then Rosalie and Emmett, next Jasper and Alice.
After telling Carlisle and Esme the strange occurrences of the day and the family all the changes I noticed in Bella and especially the challenge of resisting her, a similar argument erupted from when I had returned from Denali. Rosalie was most concerned about keeping the family safe, as was Jasper. Emmett figured I should just drain her, enjoy it, and would stage the body. Esme and Carlisle were proud of me resisting her blood, and did not want me to live with the guilt of her death. Eventually the conversation got round to the other girl having an image of me in her head.
Everyone was throwing out theories, each crazier than the last, when Emmett stated as if he had found the solution to world peace, "It's a Freaky Friday."
We all stopped and stared at him, while everyone's mental voices were expressing their confusion. Come on, like the movie. The Chinese lady wants to teach a mother and daughter a lesson and they switch bodies. Then they learn their lessons and switch back, he stated, like we were idiots for not knowing this. When no one immediately responded, he added, "It's the perfect answer. We just have to find the Chinese lady and get her to make the switch back." Then, he crossed his arms over his chest in a near dare for anyone to disagree. Shockingly, no one dismissed his suggestion outright. Annoyingly, his joke was not actually anywhere close to the conclusions I would have drawn, yet it did fit the evidence. I never suggested they switched bodies, I contradicted. I was only paying such close attention to everyone in the school due to the glitches in Alice's vision and my commitment to help pick up anomalies. "Now, Ed, you cannot steal my brilliant idea," he chastised in a teasing tone. The family had begun to see it as he meant it, a comical intervention to lighten the mood. Carlisle, on the other hand, had latched on to Emmett's suggestion. His analytical analyses were swimming with possibilities of how a soul exchange might have occurred. "Which is, really, Carlisle?" I alleged. Everyone looked at him like he had said we were aliens, except Esme, who merely appeared puzzled. "In my youth we believed in vampires, werewolves and witches," he explained.
If we know two are true as well as shapeshifters, then it is not a far stretch of the imagination to connect Edward's observations and Emmett's suggestion, lightheartedly intended or not.
Simple deduction, really. Everyone was stunned into silence, while their minds raced.
Emmett and Jasper were mostly focused on possibilities of witches, Jasper for the danger they could pose to the family, Emmett thinking about whether their magic would work on vampires and the pranks he could pull with magic.
Alice was cataloging the visions that were fuzzy with Bella. Esme was worried about Bella and the changes I mentioned. It was Rosalie who broke the silence with, "Who? Well, the girl in the cafeteria who had a memory of me had Quaalude features," I told them. "Their oral histories would certainly give credence to what we would refer to as witches," Carlisle mused. Alice jumped up and came back with paper and a pencil. Thanks, I told her, and then drew the girl. Alice and Esme were far better artists than I, but my depiction allowed everyone to have a basic image of the girl. Her father might be Lieutenant Kenneth White, Carlyle told us. This young woman was at the hospital when his mother was ill last month. The patient's son's wife, Ronnie White, a nurse in pediatrics, appears quite in heritage. I'll do some searching in the town's records, Jasper offered. If it requires some B&E, can I go with Emmett asked. Sure, Jasper agreed with a shrug. Let us learn more about the parentage of this young girl, Carlyle summarized, and Edward, please use your gift to learn more about her. You too, Alice, if possible. Alice and I both agreed easily.
No one will make any decisions or actions until we know more, Carlyle decreed, and we all consented.
Each person's thoughts swam with their own considerations of magic having been at fault for Alice's gift's glitches. Esme's were, naturally, the most empathetic, wondering what heartache might have happened for a human to tamper with magic. Alice was slightly relieved to have a potential answer, while also annoyed that a human could have caused it. Rosalie's thoughts wondered if magic could give her a baby, and Carlyle postulated that magic was behind the shape-shifting of their tribe. I'll be back before we leave for school, I told them before heading out. There was only so much I could take. Sitting on a rock high enough to see the asleep town of Forks, I could not help but be slightly amused at the fact that we had thought Forks was a sleepy small logging town with only shapeshifters to think about. The third morning waking up in Jamerica's bedroom was easier. There was no terror that greeted me. My emotions were calm enough that I could almost pretend to be waking up in Charlie's house. Or more accurately, I could almost imagine it as another move, unfamiliar for sure, but not scary. The sounds greeting me were not yet familiar per se, but a form of predictability had begun to seep into my mind. More importantly, before consciousness had fully set in, my brain had supplied where I was, and most importantly that there was no danger. The opposite was true, actually. This house was full of unconditional love, a foreign concept before, as the idea that family would be the shelter from the storms of life was something that had never existed in my world previously. For the first time in my life I had experienced being wrapped in a soft, fluffy warmth. It had penetrated me from my pores to my bones and caused me a yearning to hold tightly to this sensation. If this was the feeling most people associated with family, then I could see why they talk about family as if it was the center of their world. Renee might have been a ton of fun and she was my best friend, but this is not a feeling I would associate with her. She was too flighty and spontaneous. And Charlie was so much her opposite, yet he was awkward and independent. When I compared the feelings Jamerica's family gave me versus my emotions regarding my own parents, I would pick this feeling every time. The problem was that I missed my parents despite the feelings. Aside from the feelings, the basic elements of life were becoming less encumbered. Dressing was slightly easier, as I had more a sense of what Jamerica had in her dresser and closet. It really was the little things that gave me a sense of calm. Hopefully the lack of anxiety wouldn't end too soon, especially as nervousness had been my constant companion as Renee as well as Charlie's daughter.
Allowing the positive gifts of what Jamerica had done to me to penetrate my being, desiring to sear it to my memory, I pulled my knees to my chest.
Before too many minutes had passed, my brain reminded me of the consequences of staying in bed in this household. Not wanting to face her parents' speeches again, I got out of bed with a smile and a feeling of deep contentment. It was a wonderful experience. Despite the temporary nature of what was happening to me, this morning filled with warm affection and a pleasant mood, I was determined to enjoy it. Like a roller coaster, the ride would end, but I was betting that the joy in what happened in the meantime would stay with me for the rest of my life. Between getting up earlier and my increased ease, by the time that I was ready for the day, Jamerica's mom was still getting the boys up. Deciding to be helpful, I went down to the kitchen to make breakfast. The last 2 mornings her mom had made scrambled eggs with a few veggies in them and then toast. Wanting to make sure the family would like the food, I copied her. My first surprise was that there was no traditional milk in the fridge.
Vaguely remembering Renee talking once about how milk wasn't a Native American food, and thus discouraged by the Quileutes, it dawned on me that many of the dishes I had made over the years wouldn't work for this family.
The difference between us became more glaring, causing my eyes to water. By living in Jamerica's body, those staples I took for granted wouldn't be recommended. There would be no lasagne or Grandma Swan's stroganoff. They seemed like such minor things to be crying over, but my eyes wouldn't stop watering. Clearing my eyes with the back of my hand, I continued in my preparations, choosing to use water to replace the milk for the eggs. Nearly done, I jumped a mile when Mrs. White asked, "What you doing?" She had snuck up on me.
Turning to her, pleased to learn that my cheeks didn't warm, even though I was nervous and embarrassed, I uttered, afraid of her being upset once more, "I promised to do better, so I made breakfast."
Was that wrong? She eyed me from head to toe before speaking. "Not wrong, Jamerica, but it is a surprise. I can't remember one time when you voluntarily made food." Not to mention you're not wearing makeup, your clothes are different than those you usually choose, and you talk like a white girl. Stammering, I answered, sorry. Care to explain, she pressed. The woman was more intimidating than Charlie and caused me to want to bare my soul, but at the same time I had really begun to enjoy myself. Not trusting my mouth, I simply shook my head no. She came over to me and looked at me sternly. I know you're growing into your own woman, but that doesn't mean I'm still not your mama. I would fight the world off if you needed me to, but to do that you have to tell me what's going on. Still not trusting myself to speak, I nodded my head in the affirmative. She evaluated me critically once more before grabbing 2 of the plates and putting them on the table. We were all eating with Mrs. White, asking short questions about our preparedness for the day when Mr. White joined us. He took a few bites and then asked Mrs. White, there's something different about the eggs. Why'd you change? Jamerica made them, she answered. His eyes opened wide and he seemed to be purposefully chewing his food. Is that right? He muttered between bites. Clearly my desire to help out had exposed me, rather than my intention of blending in more, ruining my good mood. How he was going to confront me in the car had my stomach in knots, but I forced myself to eat the last 2 bites as to not draw more attention and asked to excuse myself. I got the all clear from her mother, so went up to my room, tidied, and finished putting all of the needed things together for school. At least Jamerica would have a clean room to return to. Still nervous and not having her dad ask for me yet, I went to the room the boys shared, made their beds and generally tidied up. Let's go, Jamerica, he hollered, times 8 Waston. Not wanting to face him and the interrogation that was coming, I found a few more things to do. When he yelled again, his irritation was clear, so I grabbed Jamerica's bag and scurried down and into the cruiser. We pulled out of the driveway and he stated gruffly, you're not in trouble. Making breakfast, except pouring cereal for your brothers, is unusual for sure, but nothing to call the National Guard about. He paused before continuing, care to explain? I heard what you said and I wanted to help out. Since I was awake early enough, I was just trying to do what you said, I told him while my eyes started to water once more. I wasn't usually such an emotionally expressive person and chalked it up to the body. Maybe Jamerica cried easily. You pissing? He asked, looking over at me through the corner of his eye. Shaking my head no, the question was disconcerting. His statement made it clear that crying wasn't Jamerica's norm. My only remaining guess was simply that the overwhelmingness of the situation was getting to me. Taking in a deep breath, as if he was trying to figure things out, he took a minute before stating, well, making breakfast is helpful. Just remember that eggs are a special treat. Maybe next time oatmeal, okay. Nodding in agreement, my fears that I had been found out nearly evaporated. As we pulled up to the school, he stated, and I like the more natural, less revealing version of you. I heard you, Dad, I told him, even though the title felt odd on my lips. I'm trying. His eyes seemed to flash momentarily, and the corners of his mouth turned downward for less than a second. My body tensed, expecting that I had finally said the thing that would expose me. Well, keep it up, he insisted instead with a smile. Remember to be proud of who you are and your heritage. You have something precious that no one can take from you, people who love you until the day you die.
Okay, I answered tentatively, having the internal sense of being jerked around, even though my brain reminded me that he had been more like Charlie than anything, and was likely a very straightforward, you get what you see kind of person. He sighed like we had taken 2 steps back before uttering, have a good day at school. Nodding while removing my bag and myself from the car, I then headed to my first class. I was early, but that was fine. Pulling out the book for English, I picked up reading it from where I had left off. Good morning, Jamerica, the teacher offered me, walking into the room. Good morning, sir, I responded, embarrassed that I didn't remember his name, and then buried my head back into my book. By the time class started, it dawned on me that despite my wishes and prayers the last 2 nights, I actually had no idea how long this situation would last. Once my mind was able to absorb the truth, as distasteful as it might be, it didn't take long for me to determine that blending in was going to be critical to my survival. In order to do that, learning the names of my teachers and fellow students, at least those near my seat, seemed like a smart start. Especially since, thus far, the only name I knew was Mandy, who had clearly had it out for Jamerica. Discreetly looking around the room in order to at least learn a few faces, I realized that I was the darkest-skinned person. It was nice to not be so pale in my opinion, and the idea that I might not burn while sunbathing was lovely. Nevertheless, this epiphany, even though it was plainly obvious, once I took a moment to notice, jarred me. For the first time since becoming Jamerica, I wondered if how I looked might impact my ability to make friends in similar, yet different ways than it had in Phoenix. It was a sobering thought. Unlike my first day in Forks, I paid attention to each time the teacher called on someone and began to learn names. I also found out that the teacher was Mr. Barwick, which was helpful. The class Earth Science being a review was useful, as I didn't need to focus on the material.
On the way to my next class, Mandy came up to me. I tried to just move past her, but the two girls who had been with her in the bathroom flanked her, making it difficult. Still pulling out last year's clothes, I see, Mandy jeered. Students began to stop and create a circle around us, no doubt wanting to watch the show. Certainly this was something I had experienced in Phoenix. It was almost comforting in its familiarity. There was so much about being Jamerica I had no idea how to handle or what to say, but Mean Girls was not on that list. Wow, Mandy, I replied with a fake smile and my words heavy with sarcasm, thank you for noticing my clothes. What an honor. She blinked for a few seconds like she couldn't believe that I had spoken a comeback. Truly, I was proud of myself. It was almost exactly how I had imagined responding all those times in Phoenix. Maybe those daydreams hadn't completely gone to waste. I thought you had higher standards, she eventually rebutted. You're such a wash-up now.
Oh, I have higher standards than to be a sheep like you, I retorted, while the crowd oohed, as if I had insulted her.
Beginning to realize that this wasn't going to end well, I said, excuse me, please. She didn't move and instead told me, any sympathy you got from your beloved grandmother dying is long past. No one cares about you anymore. You're just a mulatto who doesn't belong anywhere, let alone the honor to breathe the same air as me. The chorus of oohs were louder. It was a low insult for sure. A part of me wanted to defend Jamerica's beautiful family, another part wanted to run away. Before I could do either, though, Edward was to the left of Mandy's lackey. Principal is coming, he stated in a tone that set chills into the atmosphere, and the students started to scamper away.
The hairs on the back of my neck raised, my heart rate increased, I began to sweat, and my brain began to plan ways to get away from him.
My reaction had all the indicators that he was extremely dangerous. My response to his proximity caught me off guard. It had to do with this body, since I had never experienced any resemblance of fear around him prior, even on that first day in biology when he looked as if I had ruined his life by smelling like the sewer. Over and over I forced my mind to recall our second encounter. He was frustrating, sure, but kind and curious. The mind over body thing was only barely working, so I checked his eyes. They were golden, which helped relax me. Nevertheless, it took me multiple times of reminding myself that he had only been hateful towards me when his eyes were black to release most of the tension in my muscles, but the fear lingered. The only similarity to his proximity between yesterday and today was that it filled my whole world. Our prolonged eye gazing was interrupted when Mandy and her lackeys moved past me and she purposely bumped into me. Oh sorry, she stated insincerely, didn't see you there. I snorted, took one brief look at Edward through my hair, refusing to get lost in him again, before once more began walking towards my class. Despite how much Edward scared me, I felt as if I owed him one. So, taking a chance, while passing him, I looked up into his eyes and with earnestness told him, thank you. As soon as the words left my mouth, he asked, may I accompany you to class? Confused at his question, I nonetheless answered, it's a free country.
His eyes bored into mine, like he had done on my first day, the very first time we had locked eyes in the cafeteria, only this time he didn't look frustrated.
Instead, to my complete confusion, he smiled like he was laughing at his own joke. Giving up trying to decipher Edward, I started walking towards my class, attempting to focus on what might be expected of me. We had gone about 15 feet when he commented offhandedly, you handled Mandy well. Shrugging, I was uncertain of what to say. I had found another benefit of being in Jamerica's body.
She was taller than me, and so I didn't feel so small next to Edward.
It was nice. However, the sense that he was a serial killer wouldn't leave me. Not wanting to think about it more, I pushed it aside, reminding myself of our conversation upon his return, after he had been sick and we had done the lab together. Sure, he could be scary, but he could also be kind and gentlemanly. He scowled slightly, probably because I had yet to answer him. We said nothing more, and when I got to the door of my class he continued down the hall like he hadn't been walking with me. My conclusion was that he thought I wasn't worth his time, and breaking up the confrontation was him doing his good deed for the day. Maybe his family reported back one kind act they had done as they sat down together for dinner. I could imagine the children of a doctor doing that, especially the way Charlie had defended Drive. Cullen. Between learning my teacher's name, it was Mrs. Anderson, and my fellow students, while covering the Great War and trying to figure out how come my body had responded to Edward so differently than Jamerica's, my mind was tired by the end of the class. Once more English, my next class, came to my rescue. Delving into literature took my mind off everything else and allowed me to completely relax. At lunch I sat alone again in the sophomore section eating my packed food. I noticed my body flirting even more heavily with Mike, while Jessica scowled. My body snatcher's behavior was completely juvenile and a waste of my time, irrelevant of how indignant it made me. The warning bell jarred me from my musings, as I had spent the whole time trying to decide if I should tell Jamerica's parents the truth.
her parents indicating their awareness that something was off encouraged honesty, but despite my effort, I was unable to predict their reaction, which left me unwilling to start the conversation.
One option that came to mind was to confront the person living in my body. I was afraid to do so, and the chance that I would be forced into a psych evaluation. It wasn't hard to imagine her denying the whole thing and making it look like I was mentally unstable. P.E. Once more turned out to be helpful, keeping my thoughts away from the mysteries and problems in my life. It also helped that I didn't hurt anyone or get hurt myself. It was such a welcomed relief from what usually happened. The last class of my day was my worst class by far, as it was Quileute. It was beautiful, and I had heard it on the reservation when I had been younger and visited Charlie. Nonetheless, it being an intermediate class meant I was beyond lost, even though I had spent most of my study time last night trying to understand it. Walking home once more, I started on my homework as soon as I got in. By the time Mrs. White walked in the door with the boys, I was done, except for Quileute. I went downstairs, helped Martin with his homework, and then entertained him and the youngest brother, Damien. I had learned it until dinner. Mrs. While served another dish that was new to me but delicious nonetheless. Throughout the meal I debated the benefits and costs of asking for help with my Quileute. Trying to figure out which option kept me safer was a challenge, as there were risks either way. Thus, with trepidation, when we were almost finished dinner, I mentioned my need to Mrs. White. "Oh yeah?" she asked, like my statement was dubious. Nodding yes, I said nothing. "After the boys are down," she decided. "Clear and do the dishes, please," she added before getting up, taking the boys with her. I washed the dishes, while she started their bath. When there was nothing more for me to clean, I went and collected my books. When Mrs. White came to help, she looked at me in accusation. "I don't remember some of the basics from last year and I am lost," I told her. "Aha," she muttered before putting out her hand. I gave her the worksheet that had been sent home. She handed it back to me and then started explaining, first with the sounds and how they were written. Then she added some of the basics of grammar. As was probably her plan, she gave me just enough to complete the worksheet that had been sent home. She was a great teacher, and I told her so before heading up to bed. When Mr. White got home, her voice traveled up the stairs and through the cracked door. "The girl is definitely not my daughter." His answer was too soft for me to hear. It was many minutes later when she stated, "Her and Leah grew up speaking Quileute along with most of the kids that still live on the reservation. There's no way my daughter can't complete a conjugation worksheet." "Maybe it was her excuse to spend time with you," he countered, sounding frustrated. "We're going to the race on Saturday and I'm checking in with Sue. If something is amiss, you can bet that Lee's in on it." I didn't hear the rest, and sleep was hard to find. Tomorrow was Friday. For the first time, I didn't pray to return to my life as I fell asleep. I had no illusions that this would come to an end on Saturday, at the very least when the truth would come out. Despite the fear that filled me, there was also peace, because every day in this family was a blessing and I would take every moment given to me. Eventually the jig would be up, but I wasn't going to take for granted the wondrous feelings being a member of their family gave me. My wanting more of these feelings might make me a selfish person, but I was a victim, and it was completely out of my control, so hopefully some grace would be given to me. Waking in the morning, I was warmer than usual. Stretching out, I decided that Pops must have closed my window after I fell asleep. The silence surrounding me put me off, and I reluctantly opened my eyes, afraid of what I might find. What greeted me was a purple comforter. Ugh, I groaned, hating the color purple. I had to be at someone's house. For sure it wasn't Mandy's or Lee's. Seconds after scanning the room, I jumped up, pumping my fist into the air and yelled, "Yes." Immediately there was quick, yet heavy steps heading towards me. The impeding person couldn't remove the ear-to-ear grin on my face. Even though I had completed the switch with the belief that it was permanent, the worry that we would get switched back lingered. What if there was more like the movies, and after learning some lesson we would be returned to our bodies? It's not like the spell came with a manual and guarantee. This morning was even more of a dream come true, since it supported the permanence of the switch. "You okay?" Chief Swan grunted out on the other side of the door. "Really good," I told him, unable to hide my eagerness. Quickly trying to find something to explain my outburst, I blurted out, "I remembered that I have a date with Mike." He humphed loudly and muttered something about shooting him, while his steps suggested that he had headed back downstairs. This life really was like living in a fairy tale. There had yet to be a parent banging on my door. There was more money. Sure, there were a few downsides and hiccups, but nothing I hadn't handled. First things first, I wanted to continue giving Mike the best version of this body, so got myself ready for the day, including getting groomed and choosing one of the new tops. The whole affair took less time than before. It was getting easier to apply makeup to Bella's face. I knew her closet better, which helped a lot. The only part of her that was still a struggle was her hair. It was soft and slick like silk with a slight wave. Mama's hair was straight and coarse.
Pop's hair was coarse with tight curls, which would make for a great afro, if he didn't insist on having it in a short cut for work.
Mine had been in between theirs. It was curly but less than Pop's and coarse but more like Mama's kind of coarse. Figuring out how to manage Bella's strange texture was on the top of my agenda for this weekend. Grabbing a Pop-Tart, since Mike was more important than breakfast, I arrived at school before the early bell. Fortunately, Mike was already there. He was, of course, talking with Eric. Coming nearer allowed me to hear that their conversation was about Tyler. Evidently, he was home and likely to be back tomorrow. Coming up next to them, Mike turned to me. "Hey Bella," he greeted. The fact that he interrupted his conversation to greet me was a good sign. "Hey," I offered back. Doing an idea Leah had given me, I licked my lips, tasting the gloss I had applied. It seemed like his eyes followed my tongue's movement, which I took as a score. Taking a breath, I told him, "My dad asked for details about our date tomorrow." He smiled like he had won the lottery, while his eyes had a slightly dazed, hungry look. Poor Eric tried to appear like he wasn't jealous. The fact that a guy was jealous of Mike was expected. No one else compared. I talked to my mom about having my Friday shift off and she said no, but gave me Saturday morning, so how about we have breakfast and then a movie together in Port Angeles?
Smiling at this idea, as it allowed me to go shopping on Friday, I replied, "I'll need to check with my dad, but that sounds good to me."
"Pick you up about 9. Yeah, I agreed. "Great," he answered. He seemed flustered for a few seconds and then went back to talking to Eric, like I wasn't present. Wanting to continue to garnish his attention, I shivered like I was cold and then stood closer to him. It was a move I had seen in a movie once that seemed to work. He looked over at me and apologized. Then he grabbed my arm and pulled me into his chest, putting his arms around me sidewise since I had my backpack on. I was beyond pleased that the move had worked exactly like I had hoped. Eric rolled his eyes and looked at me like asking, "Are you sure you want to date this douche?" Smiling at him, I nodded, assuring him that Mike was the man for me. Eric frowned and shrugged like it's your funeral. I assumed, since he had acted jealous, Eric's little moves were to try and drive a wedge between Mike and I, so he could ask me out. It seemed pointless since, even if he wasn't my destiny, anyone could see that Mike was the better choice. A couple minutes later the warning bell sounded and we all moved towards school. Walking in, I realized that maybe Eric's display was the male version of Mandy's jealousy. Although if that were true, boys had it way better. Foolishly I had thought Mandy was my friend. When I had told her about Mike's interest in me, she had insisted that he was only being nice and actually wasn't that into me. Her whole speech reeked of jealousy. Over the weeks, as I had persisted, even though I hadn't told Mandy about my actions or plans, she got angrier and angrier at me. She continued to belittle me, insisting whenever she was within whispering distance of me that a man like Mike would never want some dark-skinned nobody like me. Her pointing out my obvious traits stung more than I would ever admit, even to Leah. Never before had our differences mattered. It was like she was trying to tell me how she was going to go on to bigger and better things, while I would end up a town nobody. My grandmama had already left me behind. Mandy becoming my biggest critic, and then dissing the physical similarities my grandmama and I shared was taking it too far. The real blow came in the girls' locker room before gym where she had insulted me horrendously in front of everyone. Rather than allowing her words to tear me down, they fueled my determination to prove her biting words wrong and find a way to show to everyone that Mike and I were meant to be together. Worse still, when I had complained to my mother about Mandy, she had said it was a part of growing up, that some friends were only meant to be on our life for a season. It was such an empty thing to say after all her years of claiming that old friends were like gold. She was always being so contradictory. She said what suited her, rather than being honest, let alone having my back. Somewhere in the back of my head it bothered me a little that Mike hadn't found the courage to overcome Fork's stupid grade intermixing to date me, as a few guys had. Not only that, but then I had to go to all this trouble to remove those obstacles. It also rubbed me the wrong way when Leah had pointed out and I had reluctantly agreed, few white boys in Forks went for the girls that were anything less than pale. Despite my general agreement, I had vehemently argued that Mike wasn't like that. He was friends with the only Asian guy in the junior class. He was nice to everyone, no matter their skin tone. Leah had tried to argue back that being friends with someone and dating them wasn't the same, but I wouldn't hear of it. Not to mention that what he said yesterday about Mrs. Cope contradicted Lee's assertions. The part Leah had highlighted and I did agree was that Bella was the palest girl in the county. That combined with her being new blood to the town, along with her being the police chief's daughter, did seem to cause every boy at Forks High to give her attention. Being with her was both a step up socially for nearly everyone except Mike, and it was easy to imagine the thrill some guys would have in getting the chief back in an indirect way. I told Leah that Mike wasn't friendly to Bella because of those reasons. He was sweet, kind, thoughtful, considerate, and worked at making everyone feel welcomed. Bella was just the most recent person to be at the receiving end. He could totally be the mayor one day, as he already had the critical components.
Leah might have been off about Mike's character, but Mandy had been completely out of line, not only with her attacks on my grandmama, but also claiming that she had spotted Mike first when we were in the 3rd grade and called dibs.
Truthfully, I had spotted Mike before that, when we were in the 1st grade. I just hadn't known to inform the world about it. I was going to show Mandy that she was wrong and my grandmama had been right. Life was short, and if I didn't take charge and make hard decisions, Mike would graduate without being brave enough to give our budding romance a chance. Not to mention that showing Mandy up would be a sweet added bonus. I knew that once Mike had picked me, Mandy would see what a great couple we were and be happy for us. Then, maybe, if I was willing to take her back, she and I could be BFFs once more. Smiling at that happy thought, I thanked my grandmama for giving me the courage to follow my dreams and happiness. At the end of the day, what annoyed me was minor and didn't really matter. The bottom line was that Mandy had been a backstabbing bitch and my mother was two-faced.
Even if she was right that the likes of ignorance on people like Mandy weren't worth trying to change, she didn't offer me any suggestions other than for me to move on, which she should know herself was impossible in Forks.
Everyone's memories here are way too fucking long, since they have nothing better to do than hold grudges. That was why me not forgetting was so important. A small voice in my head had to wonder if Mike was into me, Jamerica, or that he had won the attention of the new girl. I could almost hear my grandmama's voice telling me how wonderful I was, how beautiful, and how any guy would be lucky to date me. Empowered by her words, I reminded myself that we were meant to be, and he was lucky I had been willing to work so hard to make it come true. His strutting and showing off was down to me, as he had yet to do anything to win me. Despite my certainty, the question quietly lingered in the back of my mind if it had been my skin tone he hadn't been able to look past. There was also a small voice within my mind that was angry with my grandmama for no longer being here for me. I reprimanded myself for my anger. She would have stayed if she could have. She told me so. It wasn't her fault that her body gave out and that the medical field refused to do anything more for her. I was on my own. I was responsible to generate my own happiness, and this path was already bearing fruit, so was obviously the best one.
Pushing my concerns and thoughts aside, I assured myself that the body I inhabited had just allowed him to get to know me.
Throughout the day, Mike continued to walk with me, talking my ear off about some game him and Eric were into. When Eric showed up, they talked some more and Mike attempted to include me with statements like, "What do you think, babe? I like your ideas," I told him each time, which placated him. The morning classes were torture and I had been lost. When the lunch bell rang, I had never been more grateful for the break. Today, instead of Mandy watching Mike and I like a hawk, it was Jessica. In all of our classes and then especially at lunch, she kept trying to get Mike's attention. She had even gone so far as to wear a low-cut shirt, which showed her bra.
Sure, Mike's eyes got stuck there, but he practically ignored her, kept his arm on my chair, and continued his conversation with Eric.
The fact that he kept his affection on me pleased me greatly, reinforcing my belief that deep down inside he knew we were meant to be together. When there was a lull in the conversation, Lauren asked the table in her high-pitched voice that grated, "Did you hear that the sophomores Mandy and Jamerica were close to fighting?" Suddenly everyone at the table, except Angela, turned towards Lauren, giving her our attention. From Lauren's description, it seemed like Bella had stuck up for herself against Mandy just fine and there was no actual fighting. The part most concerning was when Lauren mock whispered and then Edward Cullen walked her to class. As soon as Lauren's words exited her mouth, my brain couldn't stop the idea of him draining my body empty of its blood. I knew to steer clear of them. Did Bella the possibility that she might not, and he take an interest in her or my body, whichever, was disgusting and disturbing thought. Given his looks, had probably fake flirt with her and smooth talk her into a walk in the forest, where he would murder her. It had been the talk of the junior class after school on Bella's first day how she had offended him. But what could I do? It's not like I was going to go warn her to stay away from the dangerous vampire who wanted her blood. That was against the tribal laws. According to the treaty history, the Cullens were safe enough, but still the idea didn't settle well with me. Even worse was the images plaguing me that he wanted to seduce her for her body, like some of the vampires in stories did. The Twilight legends only talked about the Cold One's deadly capacities, but that didn't mean some of the novels didn't have truth in it. What if the reason they drank animal blood and went to high school was to have sex with humans? What if she lost my virginity to him? Could there be anything worse?
In biology, I tried to think of all the ways to force Edward to keep his distance from Bella, but every statement that came to mind gave too much away, and then there was the whole obstacle of the Quiutes not having active protectors, so it wasn't like I had much to threaten him with.
Sure, it was weird that I was trying to protect Bella, but something about my body being at risk didn't sit well with me. As I fumed and tried to solve the problem, it suddenly dawned on me that if I got my wish to stay in this body, Bella would eventually lose my virginity to someone. In a way, it had become hers. Sure, it was reasonable for me to be possessive of it, and especially regarding Edward, but it wasn't really my problem anymore. Maybe I owed her a polite heads up that Edward was best to be avoided, but other than that she was on her own. It was sobering, and for the briefest of moments I asked myself it was worth it. Sighing again, I looked over at Mike, which immediately brightened my mood, and a smile filled my face at how lucky I had gotten thus far. He was my happily ever after, and so worth any sacrifice I had made and would make. As seemed to be Mr. Ben. As usual, every pair was supposed to be doing group work, but annoyingly Edward refused to do it for us, and I didn't understand anything about the class. Thus, he and I sat there with the work between us, neither talking nor working on it. Apart from being a vampire, he was the most irritating person I had encountered. He was arrogant and haughty. He had nothing to lose by doing the work for us both, but he refused. It was like he had the biggest stick up his ass, acting like he was better than us mere humans. Eventually, since staring at the worksheet was pointless and my brain looping on my present problems was getting nowhere, it dawned on me that, although there was a ton of things I couldn't say to Edward, confirming Lauren's story wasn't one. Thus, I asked him, Lauren said that Jamerica and Mandy were near to blows and then you walked Jamerica to class. Just being a good Samaritan, he answered in that non-human tone that grated on me. That was another thing that irritated me about Edward Cullen. He didn't ever give straight answers. All the retorts that I wanted to say were at the tip of my tongue, but every single one would make it clear that I was not Bella's one. My irritation grew until I muttered, so you can't talk to me or help me out, but you can Jamerica. Edward smirked and retorted, jealous. Not close, I bit back. You're not all that. Jessica might want to get into your pants, but I certainly don't. It seems hypocritical to refuse to help me, while you went out of your way to help Jamerica, claiming gentlemanly behavior. But being a liar and hypocrite seems par for the course with you, so I guess my confusion is misplaced. Edward had nothing more to say, which didn't surprise me. He was insufferable. I couldn't be more relieved when the bell rang. In gym, I made sure to use Bella's clumsiness to touch Mike as much as possible, along with him having multiple opportunities to touch me. They were all public appropriate, but by the end of class, Mike was giving me his full attention, talking about work with his parents and how much he was looking forward to our date on Saturday. In the girls' locker room, Jessica came over to me, her face red with righteous indignation. You're not all that, she told me. Not all what, I questioned, pretending to be confused. Mike was mine long before you moved here, she informed me. Maybe he was meant for me all along and you were just a holding space, I retorted. Jessica's face turned an even brighter red and she appeared like she was inches away from hitting me. Turning my back on her, I finished changing and reminded myself of Pop's words. God bless her. Angela came over and spoke softly to Jessica, and then Lauren told her a whole bunch of rotten things about Bella, probably for the purposes of cheering her up, even though it was nasty stuff. Pretending to ignore them all, I walked out of the locker room and waited for Mike. Then, we walked to the parking lot together. You're picking me up, I asked as we lingered at my truck. Yeah, he agreed with a slight blush. Good, he'll tell my dad, I informed him before kissing him on the cheek, only this time closer to his lips, and then hopped in the truck. Yeah, good, he mumbled, his eyes glazed over a little. Smiling at how he had been affected, I was pleased the entire drive home. Despite my inexperience with boys, I seemed to have been making all the steps necessary towards us becoming a couple. Lee's advice had been great, which was appreciated. Its effectiveness wasn't surprising, as she was so much more experienced with guys than me, with her and Sam getting engaged and all. After making myself a snack, I got started on my homework. As each day had progressed, the more concerned I had become about being able to pass the classes, especially biology and math. When Chief Swan came home, I told him my plans with Mike, which he agreed to with reluctance. Make sure to tell Mike to arrive a bit early, so that I can have a chat with him, Chief Swan insisted. Okay, I agreed, heading upstairs, essentially ending the conversation, which meant I had managed to keep my failing grades from him. Overall, I was over the moon. Chief Swan had agreed for me to go on the date. With the money for clothes he had given me, tomorrow after school I would go to Port Angeles and find the bra and panties to go with my top, so my outfit for the date will be just right. Everything was working out even better than I could have hoped. My only true concern was Edward's involvement with my body. The thought that the Cullens might figure out the swap had never been a possible problem Leah and I had considered. With 2 days' events, it was obvious, since they already lived in the supernatural world, there was a chance that they would think outside of the box in ways that Forks people might not. Then again, what could they do about it? Pointing it out would bring attention to them, and it seemed like they worked really hard at staying under the radar. Hopefully, like the treaty history mentioned, they cared a lot about staying hidden in plain sight. Maybe Leah would have an idea of how to pass my classes. She had helped with everything else.
Laying in bed the evening after confirming that Mike was truly into me, I had begun to consider ways that we could be in the same grade, so he could act on his interest in me.
Reviewing what the week prior's effort of following him had taught me, I had realized that other than his friends, he had given the new girl the most attention. She clearly wasn't his type, as she was mossy, while he was outgoing. He had just been his usual Mike, overly friendly, nice self, trying to have her feel welcome to Forks.
I can admit being jealous that she was getting his attention, platonically intended or not, when he and I were destined.
It had sparked my wish to be her. The idea of being her had moved past wishing when one day at least she had been complaining about her own life. She had offhandedly stated her desire to switch bodies with Emily. According to her, there was this one legend that had made it seem like a Quileute ancestor had managed a body swap. I had barely remembered it, but luck was on my side, because that Monday my Quileute teacher had us examine that exact legend. The next time we saw each other, I had pointed out that we should try the spell.
Leah had been beyond hesitant at that point, but I had argued out that the worst that could happen was that it worked.
It seemed at least worth attempting, and all the signs from my grandmama had been pointing in the direction of taking this step. It's ironic that even while working to convince Leah, I really hadn't expected it to work. My brain recalled the conversations Leah and I had about what to do if it had worked. At the time they seemed silly and an engagement in fantasy. Thinking about them caused a heavy weight of how much I owed Leah. I mean, it wasn't a burden or anything to pay her back. Leah had been great since grandmama died. Our friendship before her death had been more like close cousins than best friends. The place of best friend had gone to Mandy, who had held that position since kindergarten. Shortly after the funeral, instead of acting like a best friend, Mandy had dissed me, almost like she was mad at me for grieving and wanting to do my grandmama proud. In comparison, Leah had been the one to empathize with me and agree with me that honoring my grandmama and grabbing happiness with 2 hands was the best way to honor her. Thus, within a few months of grandmama's funeral, my best friend had turned into an enemy, while my cousin had turned into my best friend. What kept me sane were my grandmama's words of wisdom. In the end, Leah had helped me out and been there for me. She had been great and I wouldn't be here without her. Yet, I hadn't figured out yet how to get past Auntie Sue. In fact, since first waking up into this life, I hadn't given Leah much thought at all. I felt bad. It made me seem like a bad friend. I would have to find a way to make it up to her and keep my promise. Her and grandmama.
It was an easy conclusion that the Quileute belief that the ancestors looking after us was true, and my grandmama had helped me out by making the spell work.
At that thought, this body was filled with a warm sense, like it was receiving one of her hugs. I smiled brightly, closing my eyes, and said a little prayer to her, thanking her. I spent some more time on my homework, even math. Eventually I gave up on completing it and laid down staring at the ceiling and fell asleep with a smile on my face. Sure, classes were a problem and paying Leah back had potential complications, but overall, my days were only getting better and better. Saying my prayers as I had the last 2 nights, I sent my gratitude to grandmama. Hope you all liked the video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.